Hello, my dear friends. If you think the Vikings were all about killing and drinking, you probably haven't heard about their bedtime secrets, from bizarre sexual rituals, creepy beliefs about the power of semen, to the practice of testing brides' virginity in front of the whole village. Everything is beyond imagination. Not all stories are told in history books. Some truths are hidden, others are too strange to believe. Tonight, you'll witness what truly happened between Viking sheets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If anyone thinks Viking raids were only about stolen silver and burnt villages, they should know that women were also among the prizes taken home. When a settlement was attacked, the men were often killed first, leaving wives, sisters, and daughters exposed to capture. Those who survived the destruction were carried onto ships, not because they were spared, but because they were considered part of the spoils. Life after that moment rarely resembled freedom. For many of these women, the only choice left was to accept whatever role was forced upon them in a foreign household far from their home. Once brought into Viking lands, some of the women were turned into wives. This word in their context did not mean partnership or equality. It meant possession. A chief could present a captured woman as his new wife, and no one around him would raise a question. For other women, the fate was harsher. They were placed into servitude, expected to cook, clean, farm, and provide satisfaction in silence. It almost feels darkly amusing to see how people in power used the label of marriage to cover what was simply domination. The children born from these unions faced complicated positions. On one hand, they carried the blood of their Viking fathers. On the other hand, their mother's origins placed them lower in the household. Some were accepted and raised, though rarely treated with full legitimacy. Others were hidden away or abandoned entirely. The sagas rarely mention these children directly, but burials and genetic evidence suggest they were present in greater numbers than the texts admit. Their silence in history is itself evidence of how unwelcome their existence was in some families. Chroniclers in the lands attacked by Vikings did not ignore this pattern. Accounts from Ireland, the Frankish kingdoms, and the English coasts mention not only the loss of lives and property, but also the loss of women. These were not rare incidents. They were part of the rhythm of raiding, repeated again and again. For the Vikings, bringing home captives was not seen as shameful. It was considered a natural proof of strength. If we compare it to today, when wars are judged by land gained or governments toppled, for the Vikings, victory could be counted in human bodies taken across the sea. Inside the settlements, the hierarchy among these women was structured but harsh. A woman given to a leader was paraded as a mark of his dominance. She might be dressed in better clothes, but that did not change the lack of choice in her situation. Women given to ordinary warriors had little chance at visibility. They served their captors in daily work and in private, with no protection or voice. In both cases, the concept of refusal did not exist. There were no legal or moral systems to protect the women. Viking society recognized the power of the victor as a form of law. Captivity was not a scandal, it was a fact. For the men, the practice of taking women was not questioned. For the women, survival depended on learning to live inside the rules of a new household. Some eventually blended in, raising children and becoming silent members of the community. Others lived their lives remembering the homes they had been stolen from. Literature that survives from the Viking Age does not often express sympathy for these women. Instead, they appear as trophies in stories, symbols of a raid success. Their names are absent, their voices unheard. Yet archaeological evidence, like foreign ornaments found in Viking graves, shows that these women did not simply vanish. They were absorbed, willingly or not, into the fabric of Viking life. They carried objects, skills, and bloodlines that marked them as outsiders even generations later. What stands out is how normalized this all was. To the Vikings, it was not extraordinary. It was not a secret. It was openly celebrated as part of warrior culture. I find it unsettling to think about how an entire society could accept something so harsh as ordinary life. This contrast between our moral view and theirs shows how differently humans have justified power across time. Songs in conquered lands kept these memories alive. Folk stories in Ireland and notes from clerics in Francia spoke of the grief of families torn apart. To those communities, raids were remembered less for the silver stolen and more for the women who never returned. Meanwhile, in Viking tradition, the same events were recited as glorious achievements. The two perspectives clashed, but together reveal the full truth. Triumph for one side was lifelong tragedy for the other. Life after capture was marked by silence. Imagine the women on ships leaving the shore of their homeland, watching smoke rise behind them, surrounded by men celebrating their raid. For the warriors, this was a moment of joy, of reward, of proof that the gods favoured them. For the women, it was the start of a journey where freedom had ended. Their voices were not recorded, but their endurance was. This practice left marks that outlasted the Viking Age. It changed bloodlines, reshaped communities, and influenced how Viking power is remembered. Their reputation as explorers and traders is only part of the story. They also built their world on conquest that reached into homes and into the most private parts of life. The truth of their raids is not only written in charred ruins, but in the unspoken lives of women carried into captivity. But captivity was only the beginning, because the Vikings also believed that ritual and sex could shape the fate of their crops and their gods. Underneath the violence of raids and the silence of captured women, another side of Viking intimacy emerges, one that tied the act of sex directly to the cycle of the earth. The Vikings believed that what happened in the bedroom could influence what happened in the fields. Fertility was not only about people, it was also about the soil, the grain, and the animals that kept the community alive. The idea that ritual sex could ensure good harvests was part of their worldview, and it was treated with seriousness, not secrecy. When a chief or leader was prepared to begin the season of planting, it was expected that he would also perform a physical act that symbolized the fertility of the land. In some communities, this ritual was done in private, but in others it was done in front of witnesses. A leader might take a woman considered sacred, often chosen for her purity or her family's standing, and lie with her in a ceremonial setting. This was not framed as a scandal, but as a service. The woman was thought to carry divine blessings, and by joining with her, the leader was believed to transfer that blessing to the soil. The people who gathered did not look away in shame. They accepted it as part of the rhythm of survival. It almost sounds absurd now to think of a village treating sex as part of agriculture. But for them, it was no stranger than using manure to make fields fertile. The choice of women in such rituals was not casual. Often, she was expected to be a virgin, her untouched body seen as the clearest vessel of divine favour. She might be prepared days in advance, bathed, perfumed with herbs, and dressed in garments set aside for the ceremony. The priests would oversee the ritual, chanting and calling upon gods like Freyr, who embodied fertility and growth. Everything about the event was calculated to merge human reproduction with the cycles of nature. Reports from later sagas suggest that such rituals could be performed in public fields or near sacred groves. Fires were lit, animals were sacrificed, and then the human act followed. For the participants, this was not entertainment, it was an obligation. The fate of the harvest was thought to hang in the balance. If the ritual was done correctly, the crops would thrive. If neglected, famine might follow. In their minds, it was a direct transaction with the gods. The power of belief in these rituals meant that women involved carried a strange kind of status. Though they were chosen and guided by priests, their roles were both elevated and diminished. Elevated, because they were believed to channel divine energy. Diminished, because their personal desires or refusals had no place in the event. They were instruments, selected for what they symbolized rather than who they were. Compared to today, where a farmer might pray silently for rain, the Vikings staged their prayers through bodies and actions that were visible to everyone. What interests me is how deeply this practice blurred the boundaries between religion and intimacy. It was not only about a man and a woman, but about the community's relationship with the gods. Sex in this case was not a private act, but a social and spiritual duty. The connection between human and divine was imagined to pass through flesh, into soil, and back into the mouths of the people when harvest came. I often wonder what the women chosen for this truly felt, standing between personal identity and communal expectation. Over time, these rituals left traces in the stories passed down. Some sagas describe festivals where entire groups of people joined in acts of public intimacy, believing that collective fertility would multiply the blessing. Other references are quieter, describing a single union performed at the start of sowing. Whether grand or small, the principle remained the same: sex was a tool of survival, a way to secure life from the gods through symbolic action. Archaeological sites provide clues that support these accounts. Carved images of phallic symbols linked with depictions of grain and livestock suggest a worldview where reproduction in all forms was bound together. Altars found with both animal bones and traces of human bodily fluids hint at the mingling of sacrifice and intimacy. While scholars debate how literal the rituals were, the consistency of symbols across different regions shows that the idea was widely shared. The involvement of leaders in these ceremonies also reinforced their authority. By acting as the one who merged with the sacred woman, the chief positioned himself as the bridge between people and gods. His role was not only military and political, but also sexual and spiritual. This gave him power beyond the battlefield. He could claim that the prosperity of the community flowed directly from his body and his bloodline. For the people, this was reassurance. For the leader, it was legitimacy. For ordinary villagers, the rituals may have been both awe-inspiring and unsettling. To see their leaders enact fertility in such a direct way must have carried a mixture of reverence and discomfort, yet no one openly questioned it. The survival of the harvest was too important, and belief too ingrained, to allow for dissent. What mattered was that the cycle continued, that the fields turned green, and that the gods were satisfied. The practice also shaped gender expectations. Women were tied not only to household duties but also to the symbolic role of maintaining the fertility of the earth. Men, particularly leaders, were expected to prove their virility not just in war but in these ceremonies. Failure in either realm could be seen as weakness, a dangerous flaw in a culture that valued strength above all. As the centuries passed, some of these rituals faded, remembered more in myth than in practice. Yet their echo remained in the stories of gods like Freyr and Freya, whose names were tied to fertility, love, and harvest. In these myths, sex and survival were inseparable, just as they had been in the rituals performed in fields and groves. Rituals tied sex to survival and gave meaning to fertility. But not every belief was wrapped in ceremony or guided by priests. In daily life, the Vikings placed their trust in something far more personal. What might surprise you even more is that for them, attraction often began not with sight or touch, but with the smell of sweat. The everyday life of the Vikings did not revolve only around raids, rituals, and marriage customs. It was also shaped by smaller daily habits that reveal how they understood attraction. One of the most unusual beliefs in their world was the value they placed on body odour. For them, sweat was not something to wash away quickly. It was proof of strength, masculinity, and authenticity. Bathing was not common, and the absence of regular washing created an environment where natural smell became an unavoidable part of life. Instead of seeing it as unpleasant, the Vikings treated it as desirable. The odour of a body was thought to express power in the same way a scar or a weapon did. Men who returned from raids carried more than trophies and stories. They also carried the smell of battle, of sweat mixed with leather and iron. This was not masked or hidden, but celebrated. Women were said to prefer men who carried these scents because they represented courage and vigour. A man who smelled too clean, who had scrubbed away every trace of his body, was thought to lack the rawness expected of a warrior. It is almost laughable to imagine that being sweaty could be more attractive than being clean. Yet in Viking society, this was a mark of real manhood. The practice of infrequent bathing made this preference even more important. Water was scarce in some areas during the colder months, and heating it for bathing was seen as unnecessary work. While some sources suggest that Vikings washed more than their neighbours, they did not do so with the goal of eliminating all natural odour. Instead, they aimed to strike a balance. Too much dirt could weaken health, but too little scent could weaken desire. Sweat was thought to carry the essence of a man's life, and to lose it was to lose the very sign of his strength. For women, managing their scent involved different methods. They often used herbs, grasses, or aromatic plants, not to erase odour, but to blend it with natural smells. The goal was not freshness in the modern sense, but an earthy fragrance that complemented the body. Bundles of thyme, sage, or other plants were sometimes placed under clothing to create a mixture of sweat and herbs. This was considered inviting, not masking. If we compare it to modern life, where deodorants and perfumes are sold to hide or replace natural odour, the Vikings would have seen such products as stripping away what made a body real. The connection between smell and sexuality ran deep into their culture. Warriors who returned from long journeys were believed to carry an aura of strength that spread through their scent. Some sagas even describe how women could identify a victorious man by the odour he brought back with him. This suggests that smell was more than a background detail. It was an active part of the attraction, signalling bravery, success, and vitality. To the Vikings, desire was not shaped by polished appearances but by raw presence. The environment of Viking settlements reinforced this outlook. Longhouses were crowded with smoke, animals, and people. The air was heavy, and personal scent was always present. There was no escape from it, so instead of resisting, they embraced it. A body without odour would have seemed suspicious, perhaps even unhealthy. The sweat of men after work or battle and the natural scent of women after labour were considered honest. In a society where physical survival required constant effort, the smell of exertion was proof of contribution. I find it striking how a detail we might dismiss today could hold such weight in shaping relationships in their time. Travellers from other lands often wrote about Viking hygiene with mixed impressions. Some described them as cleaner than expected, noting that they combed their hair and washed faces more often than neighbouring groups. Others mocked them for being smelly after raids, though this criticism might have been exaggerated by enemies. Regardless, the Vikings themselves did not view odour as a flaw. It was woven into their identity and their understanding of intimacy. A strong smell was not only tolerated but celebrated, seen as a magnet rather than a barrier. Smell also played a role in distinguishing social roles. Warriors, farmers, and labourers carried strong scents from their work, while leaders and women of higher status sometimes softened their presence with herbs and oils. Yet even in those cases, the natural body was not denied. The mixture of sweat and herbs was thought to be richer than either alone. It demonstrated that even elites participated in the natural rhythm of human life, while still signalling refinement. The belief in smell as sexual attraction might also have been reinforced by their mythology. Gods associated with fertility and power, such as Freyr, were tied to the natural world. Their imagery often included earth, animals, and plants, suggesting that nature's rawness was divine. To imitate that rawness in daily life through odour could have been seen as aligning with divine order. This would explain why the scent of a warrior held greater value than artificial attempts to smell pleasant. In practice, this belief shaped interactions between men and women in simple but important ways. A man returning from labour or battle could be welcomed because his odour confirmed his effort. A woman who carried the scent of herbs and sweat was seen as appealing, not because she had erased her humanity, but because she had emphasised it. Intimacy grew from this acceptance, not from denial. The Vikings lived too close to the raw elements of nature to pretend they could escape their bodies. This outlook seems strange now, when cleanliness is often considered part of attraction. Yet for the Vikings, the body was honest in its natural state. To wash too often was to lose the very mark of life. In their minds, odour was not dirt, it was vitality. It was not a sign of neglect, it was a sign of power. By valuing body smell, they turned an unavoidable fact of life into a source of desire, a reminder that strength and survival were the true measures of worth. The smell of warriors and women carried through their halls, mixed with the smoke of fires and the scent of food. It was the background of daily life, the atmosphere in which intimacy unfolded. For them, this was not unpleasant, it was simply real. And from this reality came attraction, relationships, and the continuation of their culture. Smell was enough to define desire, yet when it came to marriage, appearances alone were not enough. Proof of purity was demanded in front of others. Yet stranger still, before marriage even began, a Viking bride could be forced to undergo a public test of her virginity. Marriage among the Vikings was not only about uniting families or strengthening alliances, it was also about control, reputation, and proof. Few customs show this more clearly than the disturbing practice of public virginity testing before a wedding. To us, it seems intrusive and humiliating, but to them, it was part of ensuring honour. A bride could not step into her husband's household without having her purity inspected, sometimes in front of others, and always under the judgment of older members of the community. It was not enough for a family to promise that their daughter was untouched. They had to prove it. The test was usually performed by women who held status in the village, often older relatives or midwives trusted to know the signs. They would examine the bride and declare whether she was still a virgin. This act gave enormous power to those women, but it gave none to the bride herself. Her body became evidence in a trial she could not escape. A single word from the examiner could alter her life, her family's standing, and the future of her marriage. It is almost comical, in a grim sense, how a community could treat a young woman like a contract that had to be inspected before delivery. If the examination revealed that the bride was not a virgin, the consequences could be severe. Her family might be forced to pay a fine, sometimes so heavy it could ruin them. In harsher cases, they could be expelled from the community, marked with shame that lingered for generations. For the bride, the outcome was worse. She could lose her place in the marriage, be discarded, or treated as damaged goods. A mistake or even an inaccurate judgment could destroy her life. What mattered was not truth but perception, and perception was decided by others. Some accounts suggest that the test was not always conducted by women. In certain communities, a man other than the groom might be given the right to test the bride. This blurred the line between inspection and violation, turning the process into something deeply unsettling. It demonstrated that the bride's body was not her own. It belonged to the community, to her family's honour, and to her husband's reputation. She was not a participant in marriage so much as an offering, examined and certified, compared to modern weddings, where the focus is often on love, trust, and shared choice. The Viking custom reminds us that marriage once began with public scrutiny instead of private vows. The involvement of the entire community made this practice even more oppressive. Virginity was not treated as a private matter, but as a public asset. People whispered, judged, and watched as the bride prepared for her test. Even if she passed, the memory of the event lingered. Every woman knew that one day she might stand in the same position, her future depending on the opinion of others. Fear shaped behaviour, and fear ensured compliance. From the perspective of Viking men, this system protected them from dishonour. A groom who married a woman declared impure could be mocked or lose standing among his peers. His family's alliances could weaken, his masculinity questioned. The virginity test was not only about the bride, it was about preserving the man's reputation. By passing the test, a woman confirmed not just her purity but his status as well. Archaeological and literary evidence support the existence of these practices. Some sagas describe disputes where the virginity of a bride was questioned and fines were issued. Legal codes from later Scandinavian history also emphasize the importance of a woman being untouched before marriage. While the methods may have varied, the principle remained the same. The female body was a guarantee of honesty in a transaction between families. The irony is that men faced no such test. Their experience or past actions were irrelevant. A man could have taken women in raids, fathered children with slaves, or engaged in public rituals, and none of it mattered. Only the bride was judged, and her value was measured in physical signs that were often unreliable. The imbalance shows clearly how power worked in Viking society. Men acted, women were judged. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how little room there was for fairness or dignity in these customs. This practice also created opportunities for manipulation. If a family wanted to block a marriage, accusations about a woman's purity could be raised even without evidence. A single claim could stain her permanently. Rumour was enough, and the test was a tool that could be twisted to serve rivalries or grudges. For the bride, there was no defence. She entered the process already at the mercy of others, and once her reputation was questioned, it rarely recovered. The virginity test reflects the way Viking society tied women's worth to reproduction. A bride was valued as the future mother of heirs. Purity was supposed to guarantee that her children would be her husband's alone. It was less about morality than about inheritance. Land, wealth, and titles needed clear lines of descent, and controlling women's bodies was seen as the way to secure them. The test was less about faithfulness and more about property. Inside the homes where these brides lived after passing the test, the memory of the ritual hung over them. They entered marriage having already surrendered their privacy, their bodies made public before they even began life with their husband. The shadow of that humiliation was part of their reality, something they shared silently with other women who had gone through it. While the community may have forgotten quickly, the women themselves could not. What makes this custom striking is not only its cruelty but its acceptance. People did not question it, they believed it was necessary. To them, purity was not an ideal but a condition, as important as land deeds or dowries. Without it, marriage could not proceed. It reveals how societies can normalize what seems unthinkable, how rituals can turn invasion into routine. For the Vikings, testing a bride was as ordinary as arranging the feast or preparing the bed. Over time, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, attitudes toward marriage began to shift. The church discouraged public testing, though suspicion of brides remained strong. The legacy of the custom survived in whispers, stories, and lingering double standards. But in the height of the Viking Age, it was a practice accepted and reinforced by all layers of society. It was woven into the very structure of family and honour. Smell had been enough to stir attraction, but purity was demanded to secure alliances. Women carried the burden of proving what could never truly be proven. Their futures hung in the opinions of others, their lives shaped by rituals that left them exposed before their community. The cruelty lay not only in the act itself, but in how ordinary it seemed to those who enforced it. Virginity tests exposed how little control Viking women had over their bodies, but for slaves, the situation was even more desperate. In their world, intimacy was not a privilege or a right. It was something they could never refuse. Slavery was a constant presence in Viking society, and with it came customs that reveal how differently power and intimacy were understood. To own another person was not only to control their labour, but also to control their body. Men who held slaves, whether male or female, were allowed to demand sexual access without shame or consequence. The concept of refusal did not exist. Slaves had no voice, no rights, and no protection. They were treated as property, and intimacy was another form of service expected from them. For Viking masters, this practice was not hidden. It was accepted openly. A man could own male slaves, female slaves, or both, and use them however he wished. Household duties, field work, and sexual service were all grouped together as parts of slavery. There was no legal structure that defined forced intimacy as a crime. It was simply another part of ownership. It is grimly funny to think how easily they blurred the line between marriage and slavery, as if both were just arrangements of possession. The lives of slaves inside Viking households were marked by constant vulnerability. Women were at risk not only from the master, but also from his sons, guests, and allies. Their bodies could be offered as rewards or tokens of loyalty. Men, too, were not safe. Male slaves could be taken for sexual use by masters, especially when domination was meant to demonstrate authority. In this culture, it was not considered unusual or shameful. It was proof of power, and power justified itself. Children born from these unions faced some of the harshest outcomes. A child of a slave mother could rarely claim the same status as a child of a free woman. In many cases, such children were quietly abandoned or killed at birth. Their existence threatened the purity of family lines and the legitimacy of inheritance. To prevent disputes, families erased them. When children were allowed to live, they often remained in slavery, repeating the cycle of servitude that had shaped their mothers' lives. Compared to modern times, where society wrestles with issues of equality and rights, the Viking view seems brutally clear. A slave was never more than a tool, no matter what bonds of blood were formed. Inside longhouses, the presence of slaves was unavoidable. They cooked the meals, tended the fires, cleaned the garments, and lay at the mercy of their masters. The atmosphere of these halls carried constant reminders of hierarchy. Free women of the household might supervise work, but even they had little power to shield slaves from sexual demands. The structure of society did not recognize consent. What mattered was ownership, and ownership overruled all. The sagas and poems of the Viking Age rarely dwell on the voices of slaves. Instead, they appear in the background, nameless and silent. When mentioned, they are often described in terms of usefulness, beauty, or fertility, never individuality. This erasure mirrors their lived reality. They were not meant to be remembered as people, only as property. Yet between the lines, their presence is undeniable. The very absence of detail in the record shows how common their exploitation was, so ordinary that it did not require explanation. Slavery in Viking lands was fed by raids. Women taken from conquered villages often became slaves, and their fates included forced intimacy. These captives were brought across seas and placed in homes where their roles shifted depending on the needs of their masters. Some were forced into the beds of warriors, others were used for labour first, intimacy second. Regardless, the lack of choice was absolute. Survival meant compliance. Resistance was punished swiftly and cruelly. The religious beliefs of the Vikings did not challenge this system. While gods were invoked in rituals of fertility, there was no divine rule protecting slaves from abuse. On the contrary, mythology reinforced ideas of dominance, where the strong claimed what they desired. The logic of war carried into the household. Just as conquered villages were stripped of wealth, conquered people were stripped of autonomy. It was not questioned. It was celebrated as part of the victory. What strikes me most is how normalized this system became. It was not a hidden crime, but a daily reality woven into the structure of society. I often find it disturbing to imagine how ordinary people could live with such cruelty and never see it as an injustice. The difference in perception between then and now is a reminder of how flexible human morality can be, depending on who holds power. Legal codes from later centuries provide glimpses of how these practices were justified. Laws might set penalties for harming another man's slave, not out of concern for the slave, but for the owner's property. A slave's value was measured in silver, and their loss could be compensated in coin, their bodies, their children. Their lives were reduced to numbers in a transaction. Even when acknowledged, it was never as human suffering but as an economic cost. The psychological toll on slaves cannot be fully known, but traces remain in the patterns of silence. Generations of captives lived and died without names recorded. Their endurance was absorbed into Viking households, their contributions forgotten. Yet the genetic record tells another story. Modern studies reveal traces of foreign ancestry in Scandinavian populations, evidence that not all children of slaves were erased. Some survived, carried forward the bloodlines, and became silent witnesses in DNA. Slavery also reinforced the image of the master as absolute authority. His ability to demand intimacy from any person in his household was a demonstration of dominance. It reminded everyone, free or enslaved, that he controlled life at every level. This authority extended to his heirs, shaping the culture of entitlement that surrounded Viking men of rank. To refuse a master was unthinkable. To suffer in silence was expected. As with many Viking practices, what shocks us today was normalized then. The absence of the concept of rape in relation to slaves did not mean the violence was less real. It meant it was invisible, buried beneath the language of property. For the Vikings, intimacy without consent was not a violation but routine, part of the order of life. This silence in their culture is perhaps the loudest proof of how deeply oppression was built into their society. Children who did survive carried heavy marks of difference. They were often excluded from inheritance, their status questioned, their lives shadowed by their mother's servitude. In some cases, they were raised as reminders of conquest, living symbols of their father's power. In others, they were denied even that, fading into obscurity as expendable. Each outcome reinforces the harsh reality that for the Vikings, the lives and deaths of slaves and their children were matters of convenience, not morality. Slavery in Viking society was not an exception, it was a foundation. To understand their world, one must face this truth. Behind the ships, the trade, and the sagas were countless lives taken, silenced, and used. Their stories may not be carved into runes, but they are written in the shadows of history, reminding us that Viking power was built on the bodies of the powerless. Life for slaves was filled with silence and fear. Their bodies were treated as possessions without a voice. But not every woman lived under such control, because some Viking women were powerful enough to choose many lovers and even gather harems of their own. Among the many customs that shaped Viking intimacy, one stands out for how it broke the pattern of male control. While slaves and ordinary women were denied choice, women of high rank or strength sometimes held unusual freedom. A female warrior or the wife of a powerful chieftain could take lovers without shame. In fact, her status could protect her, turning what would be considered dishonor for another woman into a symbol of power. This was not common for every household, but when it happened, it revealed how differently strength was measured in Viking society. For these women, the authority they held gave them room to step outside the normal restrictions of marriage. A husband might have been feared by others, but inside his hall, he often respected the will of a wife who carried both noble blood and personal influence. If she wanted a lover, she could claim one, and no man dared to question it. To resist her choice was to risk more than embarrassment. In some stories, men who refused her or spoke against her met swift punishment. It is strangely amusing to imagine that in a world built on men's conquests, some of the fiercest conquerors inside the home were women. The warriors who became lovers of these women sometimes did so willingly, drawn by the honour of serving a powerful figure. Others had little choice but to comply, knowing that refusal could cost them their lives. For the women, these relationships were not framed as shameful. They were signs of dominance, another way to display their strength. A man might boast of his victories on the battlefield, but a woman could demonstrate her authority by choosing who shared her bed. There are accounts in sagas of women who gathered groups of lovers, almost like small harems, echoing the power their husbands held with their followers. These groups were not formal institutions, but collections of men who became bound to a woman by her will. Such stories show that Viking culture, for all its emphasis on male strength, also allowed space for female defiance when backed by status. The wife of a chieftain or a respected warrior woman could bend rules that others could never touch. This practice also reflects the way Vikings admired strength in all forms. A woman who commanded fear or respect could act with the same freedom as a man. Her reputation mattered more than her gender. She did not need to hide her lovers. In some cases, her actions were even admired, turned into tales of cunning and power, compared to today, where equality is often measured by laws and rights. Viking equality appeared only in flashes, granted by force of will and the threat of violence. Inside the longhouses where these women lived, the atmosphere must have been tense. Men chosen as lovers had to accept their place, knowing they were replaceable. Husbands, often leaders themselves, sometimes tolerated these arrangements because they reinforced the image of their household as untouchable. To be married to a woman so powerful that she could keep lovers was not always considered humiliation. It could be seen as proof that their household stood above ordinary rules. For ordinary women, however, this freedom was unimaginable. A farmer's wife or the daughter of a merchant would never dare to take a lover openly. To do so would risk punishment, exile, or death. The difference shows how much power rested not in custom but in strength. Only those strong enough to command fear could escape the boundaries placed on others. For most women, the rules of purity and obedience still applied without mercy. What fascinates me is the duality of this system. On one side, women were treated as property, tested for purity, and controlled through marriage. On the other hand, women of influence could twist those same rules to their advantage, turning intimacy into another weapon of authority. I find it both unsettling and intriguing that a society so rigid could still bend its rules when faced with undeniable power. The sagas preserve these contradictions. Some tell of women who directed battles, advised kings, and kept lovers openly. Others portray women punished for even the suggestion of infidelity. These stories reveal not only how diverse Viking life could be, but also how much it depended on status. Freedom was not evenly shared. It was granted by fear, respect, and lineage. The presence of harems among powerful women shows another layer of Viking identity. Just as men collected followers and allies, some women collected lovers. It was a way to display control, to prove that they were not bound by the same limits as others. For the men involved, survival meant obedience. For the women, it was a demonstration that strength could reshape even the most personal aspects of life. In the context of Viking belief, these practices may have carried symbolic weight. Gods like Freya, associated with love and desire, were themselves portrayed as taking many lovers. To imitate the gods was not seen as scandal, but as natural. A woman who behaved like a goddess reinforced her aura of power, aligning herself with divine freedom. This mythological backdrop gave legitimacy to actions that might otherwise have been condemned. The existence of such women did not erase the suffering of others, but it reminds us that Viking intimacy was not one simple story of male domination. It was a spectrum shaped by status, strength, and circumstance. For most, there was no choice. For a few, choice was limitless. and those few became legends, remembered not only for their lineage but for the audacity of bending society to their will. Powerful women could bend the rules inside their households, but even ordinary marriages carried stories that slipped beyond control. The sagas themselves record affairs and betrayals, treating them less as disgrace and more as tales of conquest. Affairs in Viking society were not always treated as scandals. The sagas record them in detail, presenting stories of women who took lovers outside their marriages and men who accepted or ignored these betrayals. For modern readers, these accounts sound like evidence of chaos within households, but for the Vikings, they could be remembered as tales of adventure and conquest. A marriage might have been built on alliances, tests of purity, and public ceremonies, but desire often ignored those structures. The sagas did not erase these moments. They carved them into memory, making them part of the cultural record. The image of a wife taking lovers while her husband was away appears more than once in Viking stories. These women were not always shamed. Sometimes their actions were described with the same excitement used to narrate battles. The act of stepping outside marriage could be framed as boldness, a demonstration of freedom. This does not mean every community accepted infidelity, but it does show that Viking culture made room for contradictions. In one setting, a woman could be punished for impurity. In another, her affair could be sung as a triumph. It is almost humorous to imagine that betrayal at home could be retold with the same pride as victory in war. The sagas themselves are full of layered characters, and many women stand out for their roles in these affairs. Some are depicted as restless, unwilling to wait for their husbands to return from raids. Others are shown as calculating, using intimacy as a way to build alliances or weaken rivals. These stories reflect not just human desire, but also the political value of relationships. A secret lover could become an ally. An affair could shift loyalties. The personal and the political were never far apart. What makes these accounts unique is the lack of shame attached to them. Modern expectations would cast an affair as dishonour. Yet Viking stories often describe them with admiration, as if they proved the woman's cleverness or strength. Affairs became part of a saga's drama, placed alongside duels and voyages. Instead of hiding the act, the stories highlight it, turning private choices into public memory. Compared to today, when private scandals often damage reputations, the Viking way of immortalizing them in tales feels like a complete reversal. In one saga, a wife of a chieftain takes a lover while her husband is away, and when discovered, the focus is less on her guilt than on the boldness of the act itself. The saga celebrates her daring rather than condemning it. In another, a woman uses affairs to challenge her husband's authority, showing that she is not confined by marriage. These examples reveal how sagas worked less like moral guides and more like records of power. If a woman's affair demonstrated her will, it was worth remembering. Within Viking society, this freedom was not equally shared. Ordinary women, especially those without family support or status, risked punishment for stepping outside their marriages, but women of higher rank, or those connected to influential men, had more room to act. Their status shielded them, and their affairs could even be admired as symbols of vitality. The sagas often tell the stories of these women, leaving the silent majority in the shadows. The double standard is clear. Men's affairs were expected and rarely questioned. Women's affairs, while sometimes celebrated, were still dangerous if they crossed the wrong lines. Yet the fact that they are remembered at all suggests that Viking culture did not silence these stories. Instead, it preserved them, sometimes twisting them into lessons, sometimes turning them into entertainment. The sagas remind us that intimacy in Viking life was not only controlled by law or ritual, it was also shaped by rebellion and defiance. The presence of these stories shows how open the Vikings were about desire. Affairs were not erased or hidden away, but made into part of their shared identity. They may have been exaggerated, as all stories are, but exaggeration itself proves that such acts were possible and meaningful. A woman who strayed from her husband could still be respected, even admired, if her actions aligned with the saga's themes of boldness and strength. For the women themselves, affairs could be a rare chance at choice. In a society where many aspects of life were dictated by family or community, intimacy outside marriage allowed a woman to assert control, however briefly. These relationships may have been secret at the time, but once recorded in the sagas, they became permanent. The women's names lived on, their choices immortalized. To some, this may have been a form of liberation, however limited. I cannot help but think about how powerful it must have felt for these women to know their actions would be remembered, not erased. The sagas also reveal the reactions of husbands and communities. Sometimes men fought duels over affairs, framing the issue as a matter of honor. Other times, they tolerated or ignored them, perhaps recognizing the futility of resistance. In both cases, the stories suggest that affairs were not rare. They were part of the rhythm of Viking life, acknowledged openly, even if not always approved. In households, the atmosphere around these affairs must have been tense. Servants and relatives often knew what was happening, yet silence was necessary to preserve peace. At feasts and gatherings, rumours could spread quickly, turning private acts into public knowledge. But rather than ending lives or destroying families, these affairs often became new stories to tell, fuel for the sagas that defined Viking memory. The existence of these tales challenges the idea that Viking society was uniform in its rules. On one hand, purity tests and restrictions on women's choices show strict control. On the other hand, sagas celebrating affairs reveal flexibility, even admiration for defiance. Together, they paint a picture of a society that valued strength in all forms, including the strength to break boundaries. Affairs were not always acts of passion alone. They could be strategic, playful, or rebellious. They added layers to Viking households, shaping relationships in ways that went beyond marriage contracts. While they brought risk, they also brought recognition. The women who engaged in them became part of the cultural fabric, remembered for their audacity. In the end, the sagas remind us that Viking intimacy was never simple. It was bound by rituals, shaped by power, and yet constantly pushed against by personal choices. Affairs were not erased. They were woven into the stories that defined the age, showing that even in a society ruled by warriors, women carved out space for their desires. Marriages were supposed to hold households together, but affairs revealed how fragile those bonds could be. The sagas that tell of betrayal and passion also prepare us for the next layer of Viking intimacy, where even jealousy itself was treated not as strength, but as weakness. Jealousy, a feeling so common in many cultures, was treated very differently in the Viking world. While in most societies a man who defended his wife's honour might be praised, among the Vikings such a reaction could be seen as weakness. A husband who showed jealousy risked mockery, labelled as being controlled by his wife. In sagas and poems, the man who could not control his emotions was not respected. Instead, he was ridiculed. The Vikings prized strength and independence, and jealousy was the opposite of both. In their worldview, to be jealous meant admitting dependence on another person's loyalty. A strong warrior was expected to control his household with confidence, not anxiety. If his wife strayed, the blame was rarely placed on her but on his lack of authority. To show anger or sorrow in public was worse than the act itself. It revealed fragility. It is almost darkly amusing that a man could conquer in battle but lose respect simply by showing he cared too much about his wife's choices. The sagas contain episodes where husbands are mocked for their jealousy. One tale describes a man whose wife was known for taking lovers. When he confronted her, his peers laughed at him, calling him weak. Instead of sympathy, he received scorn. For the community, his failure was not that his wife was unfaithful, but that he cared. The proper response was to ignore or even accept it. The greatest shame was not betrayal, but emotional reaction. This cultural outlook shaped behavior in marriages. Husbands learned to hide their feelings, even when they knew of affairs. To speak openly would damage their reputation. To act possessively was worse than to remain silent. The result was a society where jealousy became an insult, used in poems and insults to attack men's honour. A rival could mock another by calling him wife-ruled, suggesting he lacked true strength. For Vikings, control meant calm detachment, not emotional outbursts. This detachment extended into practices that seem shocking today. In some sagas, husbands are recorded as gifting their wives to trusted friends or allies. What might appear as betrayal was instead framed as generosity or loyalty. A man who allowed his friend to sleep with his wife demonstrated confidence, showing that he did not fear loss or humiliation. Such acts were not always common, but their presence in the stories proves they carried symbolic meaning. They reminded others that men owned, rather than clung to, their households. Compared to modern times, where jealousy is often proof of passion, in Viking society, it was evidence of weakness and a fragile spirit. Inside the household, this expectation must have shaped relationships in subtle ways. Wives knew that their husbands would not openly show jealousy, no matter what they did. This could give women more room to act than in societies where husbands impose stricter control. At the same time, it created distance. A wife could not expect her husband to show protective anger. Instead, she might live with silence, unsure if it came from confidence or indifference. The absence of jealousy changed how intimacy felt, reducing the emotional ties that might have existed elsewhere. The cultural rejection of jealousy also fit into Viking ideals of masculinity. A man was measured by strength, honour, and self-control. Losing his temper over a wife's actions undermined all three. To maintain status, he needed to appear above personal feelings, almost detached from household drama. This mirrored the warrior's discipline on the battlefield. Just as a warrior did not flinch under pain, a husband was not supposed to flinch under betrayal. The appearance of indifference became a form of armour at feasts and gatherings. This attitude played out in public banter. Men insulted one another with jokes about wives and lovers, testing each other's reactions. The one who laughed along proved his strength. The one who grew angry revealed weakness. These exchanges reinforced the idea that jealousy was shameful. Social standing depended not only on victory in raids, but also on the ability to endure mockery without showing hurt. For women, the rejection of jealousy could open doors. Some wives used the silence of their husbands as freedom, engaging in affairs with less fear of public punishment. Their husbands might not like it, but they rarely dared to show emotion. The sagas reflect this tension. They tell of women whose actions tested boundaries, knowing that the greatest risk was not their behaviour, but their husbands' reactions. As long as men stayed silent, women's choices could slip by. At the same time, this freedom was dangerous. A husband who appeared too passive risked his reputation. He could be challenged by rivals, accused of weakness, and even lose authority in his household. So while open jealousy was mocked, quiet control still mattered. Men had to balance silence with subtle actions, ensuring they kept power without exposing feelings. The result was a culture where marriages carried layers of hidden tension, with both sides aware of what could and could not be shown in public. This outlook also explains why betrayal appears so often in sagas. Affairs and exchanges of wives were not erased but woven into the stories of warriors and households. They added drama, but they also reinforced values. The man who tolerated infidelity without jealousy was not destroyed by it. Instead, he remained powerful. The sagas remind us that strength was not about perfect households, but about an unshakable reputation. Archaeological evidence cannot capture emotions, but it does reveal the material side of these relationships. Items exchanged between households, including jewellery and clothing, suggest networks of alliance that may have included wives as symbols of trust. While we cannot know how individuals felt, the broader culture made clear that intimacy was tied to power. Jealousy had no place in such transactions. For modern readers, this approach is difficult to accept. It clashes with the idea that love and loyalty are built on exclusivity. Yet for the Vikings, intimacy was secondary to strength. What mattered most was how one appeared before others. A man could survive betrayal, but he could not survive ridicule. I often think about how cold it must have felt to live in a society where silence was valued more than honest emotion. In the end, jealousy in Viking culture was not a sign of passion, but of weakness. To care too much was to lose control, and control was everything. Their rejection of jealousy reflects a society built on power, pride, and appearances. The sagas capture this truth, mocking jealous husbands and praising those who remained unshaken. Affairs may have been tolerated and jealousy despised, but these stories only set the stage for another layer of Viking intimacy. Beyond personal affairs, some men faced challenges that tested them in more public ways, competing directly for women in contests of strength and desire. Viking society admired strength, courage, and the ability to prove oneself in every aspect of life. Battles were not fought only with swords and shields. Some challenges were carried into the most intimate spaces, where men were expected to show power in ways that still shock us today. Among these customs was a practice described in sagas as sexual competition, where warriors tested themselves not only in combat but also in the bedroom. A man might have to satisfy a woman to win her hand, and his success or failure could determine his honour, his future, and even his life. This practice was not widespread in every community, but the sagas and poems suggest it existed strongly enough to become a recognised theme. The idea was simple in form but brutal in consequence. Two or more warriors might seek the same bride. Instead of settling the matter with weapons, they proved themselves through sexual performance. The woman became the judge, and her decision shaped reputations. What was intended as marriage became a contest, one that carried the same weight as a duel. It is almost laughable to think that Viking honour could rest not on a battlefield but on a bed. Yet this was exactly how some stories remembered it. For the warriors, the stakes were enormous. To fail in such a contest was not only personal embarrassment, it was public humiliation. A man who could not prove his virility might lose all respect from his peers. The sagas describe cases where defeated men were mocked, their names tied forever to failure. In a culture built on pride, such dishonour was unbearable. Some men, unable to live with the shame, were said to have taken their own lives. The seriousness with which these contests were treated shows how central sexuality was to Viking identity. It was not a private act, but a measure of worth. The woman involved carried significant power in these situations. Her satisfaction determined the outcome, and her words could raise one man while destroying another. This power was rare for women in Viking culture, where choices were often limited. In these contests, however, the woman became the centre of judgment. Her role was both respected and feared. To be chosen as the subject of a challenge meant being placed at the heart of male rivalry, a position that carried risk as well as influence. Sagas often describe these events with striking detail. Unlike battles, which were sometimes summarised quickly, these contests were remembered for their intimacy. The descriptions focus on the acts themselves, on the performance of the men, and on the reaction of the woman. For Viking audiences, these stories must have been both entertaining and instructive. They reinforced the idea that strength was not complete without virility. A man could be a great fighter, but if he failed in bed, his reputation was broken. Compared to modern times where personal intimacy is considered private, Viking sagas remind us of a world where sex could become a public spectacle. The psychological pressure on men was immense. To prepare for a duel of swords was one thing. To prepare for a duel of intimacy, with honour at stake, must have carried fear of a different kind. Success brought pride and marriage. Failure brought ridicule and sometimes death. This shows how fully the Vikings tied masculinity to performance. A man's body was not only a weapon in war but also a tool of reputation in private life. Women's perspectives, while harder to trace, can be imagined through the consequences of their judgment. A woman who declared one man successful and another a failure shaped more than her future. She influenced the standing of warriors, families, and alliances. The weight of such decisions must have been heavy, yet sagas portray them as decisive. They did not hesitate. Their words were final. In a society where women's voices were often muted, this rare moment of power stands out, even though it came through a troubling context. These contests also served as a form of ritual. They were not only about marriage, but also about proving the readiness of a man to take on the responsibilities of family and household. A warrior who failed in intimacy was thought to lack the strength needed for leadership. Virility was seen as directly connected to vitality. The ability to satisfy a woman was interpreted as the ability to sustain life, to father children, and to maintain prosperity. In this way, the contest was symbolic as well as literal. At feasts, such stories would have been retold with both laughter and seriousness. Men boasted of their victories, while failures were turned into insults. A defeated man's name might live on as a joke, ensuring that his shame never faded. Honor was fragile, and even one failure could outweigh a lifetime of achievements. This shows how unforgiving Viking society could be. It demanded excellence in every field, even in the most private ones. The sagas that record these events are not simply tales of entertainment. They reveal how the Vikings linked every part of life to competition. Farming, raiding, politics, and intimacy were all arenas for proving strength. The line between public and private was thin, and reputation was always at risk. For modern readers, the detail of these accounts can feel intrusive. Yet for the Vikings, there were lessons about courage, stamina, and pride. I find it deeply unsettling that a society could turn private failure into a death sentence. But it also shows how seriously they took the idea of honor. Archaeological evidence does not directly confirm such contests, but the cultural emphasis on virility is clear. Symbols of fertility, carvings of exaggerated male forms, and references in poetry all point to the same value masculinity was measured in performance. The contest described in sagas may have been exaggerated, but exaggeration itself suggests that the practice, or at least the idea of it, was familiar to audiences. What remains clear is that sexual competition reflected the Viking obsession with testing limits. They did not confine competition to battlefields. Every part of life became a trial. To live among them was to live under constant expectation, never free from judgment. Success brought respect. Failure destroyed it. This truth applied to warriors, farmers, and leaders alike. Intimacy was simply one more arena where strength had to be proved. These stories remind us that Viking society was built on extremes. Honor was everything, and dishonor was unbearable. Sexual contests may sound shocking, even absurd, but they fit perfectly into a culture that prized rivalry. For the Vikings, to compete was to exist, and to exist without competition was unthinkable. Affairs had already blurred the lines of loyalty, and jealousy had been mocked as weakness. Sexual contests pushed these ideas further, turning intimacy into another battlefield. But even stranger than these challenges was the belief that some women lay with gods or monsters, creating legends that blurred the boundary between human and divine. Viking belief was not limited to the visible world of ships, raids, and farms. Much of their culture rested on the idea that gods, spirits, and strange creatures moved constantly among them. In this space between the natural and the supernatural, sexuality was often described in ways that blurred the line between human and divine. The sagas and later tales contain references to women who were said to have been visited by gods, possessed by spirits, or even approached by monstrous beings. These stories were not told as nightmares but as explanations for unusual births, powerful descendants, and the blending of the human with the mythical. One recurring theme was the belief that a woman could be entered or possessed by a god during states of trance or sleep. Such encounters were described as physical unions, leaving the woman exhausted but filled with the presence of the divine. These moments were often linked to prophecy or special powers granted to her or her children. For the people who heard these stories, the boundary between hallucination and reality did not matter. What mattered was that the gods had chosen to cross into human lives through the act of intimacy. It is almost grimly funny that what we might dismiss today as a dream or delusion was treated as evidence of holy desire. Another theme found in the stories is the visitation of monstrous figures, sometimes described as dragons or other powerful beasts. A tale might describe a woman in a temple or sacred space who claimed to have been approached by such a creature at night. These unions were not always seen as shameful. On the contrary, they were presented as extraordinary, marking the woman as touched by forces beyond the ordinary. If a child were born later with unusual traits, these traits could be explained as the inheritance of the supernatural father. The children of such unions were remembered with fascination. If a boy showed remarkable strength or a girl displayed unusual beauty or skill, it was said to be the blood of gods flowing in their veins. Sometimes deformities or strange features were also explained this way. Instead of seeing them as misfortunes, families might present them as signs of divine lineage. A child with a crooked limb or a strange face could be called the son or daughter of a god, giving the family prestige, compared to the modern world, where unusual traits are explained by science. Viking society often preferred to see them as proof of divine or monstrous heritage. These stories also reflect the way religion and sexuality were deeply tied together in Viking life. The gods themselves, such as Odin, Freya, or Freyja, were often portrayed as active in love and desire. If the gods behaved in this way, it was only natural to imagine them reaching into human households in a similar fashion. A woman who claimed such an experience was not silenced. Instead, her story became part of the shared mythology, a tale retold at gatherings to remind listeners that the gods were near. Priestesses and women in temples were particularly associated with these kinds of encounters. Their role as intermediaries made them vulnerable to such stories. A woman who entered trances, sang sacred songs, or slept in holy spaces could later be described as having lain with gods or spirits. Whether she truly believed it or not, the community might accept it as fact. This reinforced her authority, linking her more closely to the divine. In some cases, it may also have served as a way to explain pregnancies that otherwise would have raised scandal. The explanation of a god's visit protected her status. The use of these myths also reveals the Viking desire to connect every event in life to something larger. Birth was not just biology, it was destiny. A child born with special gifts had to be the result of a union with divine power. These myths removed chance and replaced it with purpose. They turned personal events into cosmic ones, weaving ordinary lives into the fabric of myth. Communities sometimes celebrated these stories openly. A child said to be fathered by a god might be given special treatment, raised as someone destined for greatness. Even if others doubted, the tale provided prestige. For families seeking influence, such stories were valuable. They elevated their name above others, aligning their household with the divine. In this way, myths about unions with gods or monsters were not just beliefs, they were tools of social power. The sagas also preserve darker versions of these tales, where such unions brought misfortune. A child might be feared rather than honoured, seen as cursed instead of blessed. These contradictions reveal how flexible the stories were, bending to the needs of the moment. A powerful warrior could claim a godly descent to strengthen his position. A rival might dismiss the same story as a curse. Truth was less important than usefulness. For women, being part of such tales was both a burden and a form of recognition. On one hand, they lost control over their own stories, recast as vessels for gods or monsters. On the other hand, they gained a place in myth that ordinary women could never reach. Their lives, whether by choice or by rumour, became linked with forces beyond human reach. I often think about how unsettling it must have been for these women to live between admiration and suspicion. Their intimacy turned into legend. The fascination with divine or monstrous unions also reflected fear of the unknown. The Vikings lived close to wild landscapes filled with mystery. Mountains, forests, and seas were home to creatures both real and imagined. To believe that such beings could cross into human life was natural. Tales of dragons, giants, or spirits approaching women reinforced the sense that the world was never entirely safe, never entirely human. At feasts, these stories provided drama, wonder, and moral lessons. They entertained, but they also reminded listeners of the closeness of the supernatural. To laugh, to gasp, or to feel awe at such tales was to participate in the collective recognition that gods and monsters might be watching. These tales turned private experiences into shared reminders of the power beyond human reach. The union of humans with gods or monsters may sound fantastic to us now, but to the Vikings, it was another way to explain the mysteries of birth, power, and destiny, whether celebrated or feared. These stories shaped the way people understood their place in the universe. The boundary between human and divine was thin, and intimacy was one of the ways that boundary was crossed. Sexual contests among warriors had already shown how desire could become a public spectacle, but these myths pushed the idea even further, into the realm of legend. The next step in this story leads us to another practice, where marriage itself was stripped of emotion and reduced to little more than a transaction of wealth and property. Marriage in Viking society was not usually about love or affection. It was first and foremost about property, alliances, and control. A man could secure a wife in much the same way he might secure land, livestock, or weapons. Negotiations were carried out between families, with the girl herself rarely having a voice in the process. Fathers or brothers decided her fate, and the value of the match was measured in wealth, not emotion. A wife was an asset that added to the strength of a household, binding two families together or increasing the power of one. The process often involved a bride price, an agreed sum or offering of land, weapons, or livestock. This payment was not symbolic. It was concrete, a transfer of wealth that proved the seriousness of the match. In this way, marriage resembled a business deal, with the woman treated as the subject of the bargain. For the men involved, it was about consolidating influence. For the woman, it meant a future chosen for her. It is bitterly ironic that a warrior could raid distant lands for treasure, but still have to pay for his wife as though she were part of the loot. The young women caught in these arrangements lived with little freedom. They could be given to much older men, to foreigners, or even to rivals if it meant securing peace. Some marriages stabilized communities, while others deepened rivalries when agreements failed. What mattered most was not happiness, but the exchange of value. A woman was judged by what she could bring in status and fertility, not by her wishes. The sagas record many such arrangements with a matter-of-fact tone, treating them as normal. Fathers boasted about marrying daughters into strong households. Brothers treated sisters as assets to be traded. The lack of shame in these accounts shows how deeply accepted the practice was. Even ceremonies reflected this reality. Weddings were often less about romance and more about confirming the transfer of goods, sealing contracts in front of witnesses. Within the home, the wife's position could vary. Some grew into respected figures, managing households with authority. Others remained little more than possessions, ignored unless needed for childbearing. The difference often depended on the woman's personality and the respect she commanded. But at the beginning, her entry into marriage rarely depended on her own choice. She was chosen, given, or sold. Compared to modern ideas of marriage, which often emphasize affection and partnership, the Viking approach appears stark and transactional. In today's world, choosing a partner is often about personal feelings, but for the Vikings, choosing a partner was closer to negotiating a contract over cattle or farmland. This perspective reveals how differently intimacy was shaped by cultural needs. The power imbalance in these marriages was obvious. A man gained land, alliances, or labour through his wife. A woman gained security, but at the cost of freedom. Her worth was defined externally by men around her. For many, this became the reality of life without protest, because the system itself left little room for dissent. Archaeological finds support the idea of marriages as exchanges. Grave goods often include dowries, gifts given as part of the marital agreement. Documents carved into stone or remembered in sagas describe deals where daughters were promised in return for weapons, livestock, or political support. These were not exceptions. They were the foundation of Viking marital structure. The emotional lives of women within these arrangements are harder to recover. Some sagas mention resistance, where a woman refused or even fled. Others suggest acceptance, with wives supporting their husbands loyally. Between these extremes, there must have been many silent lives, where women carried the burden of choices made for them. Their voices rarely appear, overshadowed by the louder accounts of men's negotiations. Despite the transactional nature, these marriages were not meaningless to society. They created the bonds that held clans together, prevented wars, or expanded influence. A powerful marriage could elevate a family, just as a failed one could weaken it. The personal was inseparable from the political. Even if love was absent, the outcome mattered deeply. For men, the act of buying a wife carried prestige. It proved they had wealth to offer and families willing to trade with them. For women, it was a test of endurance. Their ability to adapt, to manage a household, and to bear children determined whether the bargain was considered successful. A barren wife, or one who could not handle the responsibilities of the household, might be cast aside. Her family blamed for the failed match. The coldness of this system stands out most when described in simple terms. To take a wife was like taking new livestock, a comparison that was not considered insulting but ordinary. This bluntness reflected the way Vikings viewed human relationships, always through the lens of survival and prosperity. The sagas do not glorify love stories in the way later cultures did. Instead, they glorify alliances, wealth, and the ability to secure advantage. Love, if it appeared, was secondary, often a complication rather than a foundation. To read them now is to enter a world where intimacy was woven tightly with economics, leaving little space for affection. I find it striking how normalized this was for them, to the point where no one seemed to question that a woman's life could be measured in weapons or land. Marriage without love may seem bleak, but it fits the Viking sense of order. Families gained power, communities stabilized. The system worked according to its logic, even if individuals suffered within it. That logic carried on for generations, reinforced by ritual and repetition. Yet behind the deals and contracts, rituals often carried a different flavour. Some ceremonies tied to gods like Freya added elements that mixed sexuality and sacrifice, blending human arrangements with spiritual meaning. These practices show that even the most transactional unions could be linked to myths, turning them into events larger than life. The purchase of brides and the absence of choice in marriage show the hard reality of Viking intimacy, but the culture also connected sexuality with their gods in ways that transformed even solemn unions into moments of ritual. The next part leads us into those ceremonies where sacrifices and sexual rites were performed in the name of the gods. Rituals were central to Viking life, shaping how they understood both the world of men and the realm of gods. Among the most striking ceremonies were those that connected sexuality with worship, especially rituals tied to the god Freyr. Freyr was associated with fertility, abundance, and harvest, and his worship often carried explicit sexual themes. To honour him, Some communities performed dances and acts that today would be seen as shocking. These were not private indulgences but communal expressions of faith, performed in front of others as part of sacred tradition. In some accounts, rituals dedicated to Freya included naked dances. Participants, both men and women, moved together in open spaces or temples, their bodies exposed as symbols of honesty and connection to nature. The absence of clothing was not about shame but about purity, stripping away barriers between humans and gods. The movements of the dances often imitated fertility and union, reminding everyone present of the cycles of life and reproduction that sustained their survival. But these rituals did not stop at dance. Some involved group sexual acts performed in the presence of the community. Such acts were not treated as vulgar but as offerings, a way to call down divine power. The belief was that physical union echoed the joining of earth and sky, male and female, mortal and divine. By reenacting this union, participants believed they were helping ensure good harvests, healthy livestock, and continued prosperity. It is unsettlingly ironic that while other societies prayed with silence and words, the Vikings prayed with their bodies in ways that blurred worship with desire. Orgasm was seen not only as pleasure but as spiritual energy. The Vikings believed that the release of life force during climax could help invite the gods into the world. Just as blood sacrifice offered strength to the divine, sexual energy was another kind of sacrifice, a bridge between human flesh and spiritual presence. This belief gave sacred weight to acts that elsewhere might be considered sinful. To the Vikings, these ceremonies were not indulgences, they were a necessity. The communal nature of these rites created a sense of shared purpose. Families and clans gathered together, knowing that participation connected them to the survival of crops and herds. To refuse might risk angering the gods. For this reason, even those who felt hesitation likely joined in, following the rhythm of tradition. What might look like chaos to outsiders was, for them, order, an echo of myths where gods themselves engaged in acts of fertility to sustain the world. Women played a central role in these ceremonies. Some acted as priestesses or ritual leaders, guiding the acts and ensuring that the proper prayers were spoken. Others were participants whose bodies symbolized the fertility of the land itself. Their role was honored, not degraded. They were seen as vessels of divine energy, linking the needs of the community with the favor of the gods. In these moments, gender roles shifted, giving women a rare but powerful position in spiritual life. The sagas and later accounts do not shy away from describing these rites. They speak of communities gathering, of chants and songs, of movements that imitate union. These details reveal that sexuality was not hidden or avoided but integrated into the sacred. For Vikings, the boundary between intimacy and ritual was porous. What mattered was not modesty but effectiveness. If the gods were pleased, the community survived. That logic justified the acts and preserved them across generations. The role of Freya in these ceremonies is crucial. As a god of fertility, Freya was believed to govern the success of crops and the well-being of families. His statues often emphasize sexual imagery, with exaggerated symbols of virility. Offerings to him sometimes included sacrifices of animals, but alongside blood sacrifices came acts of sexual expression. To honor Freya without sexual rites would have felt incomplete. Communities also believed that during these ceremonies, gods could descend into participants. When bodies united, the gods were thought to be present, sharing the act and blessing the union. This belief gave even greater importance to reaching climax, which was interpreted as the moment when divine presence was strongest. The act was not for individual pleasure, but for communal benefit. Archaeological finds support these stories. Carvings and statues of Freya often emphasize fertility symbols. Some sacred sites contain evidence of gatherings that may have included dance and ritual feasting, consistent with the accounts of fertility rites. While direct proof of group sexual acts is harder to confirm, the myths and sagas provide strong cultural evidence that such practices were accepted. The intensity of these rituals must have left a deep impression on participants. To share in such acts publicly bound the community together in a way that went beyond ordinary worship. Everyone became part of the offering. Everyone was responsible for calling down divine favour. For outsiders, this might seem invasive or degrading, but for Vikings, it was simply another way to prove devotion. Over time, as Christianity spread, these rituals became targets for suppression. Christian writers described them as obscene, using them as evidence of pagan corruption. Yet even in these hostile accounts, the importance of the rites is clear. They were widespread enough to concern missionaries, and deeply rooted enough to resist easy erasure. The memory of these practices survived in stories and symbols long after they stopped being performed. Compared to today's religious gatherings, where worship often separates the spiritual from the physical, Viking rituals fused the two so completely that the body itself became the altar. For the Vikings, sexuality was never purely personal. It was a force that shaped harvests, herds, and the fate of entire clans. By linking it with sacrifice, they gave it sacred meaning. This perspective reminds us how differently they viewed the body and desire. Where modern thought often divides the sacred from the sensual, Viking culture brought them together. I often think about the effect this had on individuals. To participate in such rituals must have been overwhelming, combining personal exposure with communal responsibility. I find it both fascinating and disturbing that something as private as sexual climax could be turned into a tool for survival, demanded not for love but for the gods. Rituals of sacrifice tied to sexuality reveal a society that saw no shame in blending the physical with the divine. For them, it was another way to survive, another way to honour their gods, another way to hold their world together. Yet while these ceremonies celebrated fertility and divine presence, the Vikings also held complex views about sexuality itself, especially when it crossed boundaries of gender. The next step takes us into their views of male and female roles, where same-sex relations were judged not by love but by position. Viking society had its logic when it came to sexuality, and that logic does not align with the categories most people use today. In their world, intimacy between men was not automatically seen as strange or dishonourable. What mattered most was the role each man played in the act. A warrior could be respected if he took the active, dominant position, but if he was seen as the passive one, his honour was questioned. For the Vikings, it was less about gender and more about power. This distinction shaped how men were judged. Masculinity was not destroyed by lying with another man, as long as the warrior proved himself in the position of control. To be on top was to show strength, and strength was the foundation of respect. To be beneath, in body or spirit, was to accept weakness, and weakness was mocked. The act itself was secondary. The position defined reputation. It is almost darkly humorous to realise that a Viking could boast about sleeping with men and still be praised, as long as he never admitted to being the one underneath. The sagas and poems reveal that insults often focused on accusing a man of being passive. To call someone Arger or Ergi was to suggest he had been penetrated, and this was considered deeply shameful. Such accusations could spark duels or even blood feuds. A warrior's reputation rested not on avoiding men entirely, but on avoiding weakness. Control and dominance remained the ultimate measure of masculinity. This perspective is very different from many modern ideas about sexuality. In today's world, conversations often focus on identity and orientation, but for the Vikings, the dividing line was about dominance and submission, not about gender itself. Their framework reflected a broader cultural obsession with strength. Just as they mocked jealousy or praised victory in sexual contests, they framed intimacy as another arena for proving power. The cultural logic also explains why some warriors could openly admit to such relationships without losing respect. If a man had the courage to raid, fight, and dominate in all aspects of life, then his private acts with men didn't matter, unless he slipped into passivity. Even then, The shame was not about intimacy itself, but about what it symbolized. To yield was to fail, and to fail was dishonorable. This distinction had real consequences in daily life. A man accused of being passive might lose standing in his community. Rivals use such insults to weaken each other's reputation, knowing that the accusation alone could harm. Words carried power, and even if unproven, rumours could stain a name for years. To defend honour, men sometimes challenged accusers to fights, hoping to prove their strength through violence. Reputation could not be separated from how others spoke of you. Women's roles in this framework were more fixed. A woman was expected to be the passive partner in intimacy, and this was not seen as shameful. Her strength was measured in other ways through household management, alliances, or in rare cases, battle. But for men, being passive was an inversion of the natural order as the Vikings understood it. It broke the hierarchy that placed warriors above others. That was why the insult stung so deeply. Despite the harshness of these judgments, the fact that intimacy between men was not forbidden outright reveals an openness unusual for the time. Other societies often condemned such acts entirely, but the Vikings carved out a space where they could exist, as long as the rules of power were maintained. This flexibility shows how their values were shaped less by rigid morality and more by an obsession with strength and dominance. These views also tied into their religious beliefs. The gods themselves sometimes blurred boundaries. Loki, for example, was said to shift forms and even genders, bearing children in unusual ways. Such myths suggested that intimacy and identity were fluid among divine beings. Humans, however, were bound by honour. The gods could transform and submit without shame, but men were judged by their peers, and peers demanded proof of strength. The sagas occasionally reference men accused of weakness in bed, and these stories highlight how dangerous such accusations could be. A man might fight to the death rather than live with the label of being passive. Honour was fragile, always at risk of insult. This constant threat reinforced the pressure to dominate in all areas of life. Even private acts could become public reputation. Communities reinforced these rules through humour, song, and ritual insult. At feasts, men exchanged taunts, testing each other's patience. To accuse another of being weak in bed was one of the sharpest insults, striking at the core of his masculinity. The man who laughed it off proved his strength. The man who grew angry revealed insecurity. Once again, the line between intimacy and public life was thin. What strikes modern readers is the bluntness of this system. There was no attempt to categorize men by identity. They were not labeled by who they desired, but by how they acted. Desire was accepted. Weakness was not. This focus on dominance mirrors the Viking worldview in other areas: raiding, ruling, and even worship. To live was to control, and to control was to be honoured. Archaeological evidence supports the emphasis on virility. Symbols of male power, carvings of exaggerated genitals, and even artifacts linked to fertility rites reveal how central masculinity was to Viking thought. These symbols were not hidden. They were displayed, reinforcing the importance of male strength in every sphere. The acceptance of male intimacy fits into this pattern, shaped by power rather than secrecy. For women, these beliefs created a strange contrast. While they could gain status through affairs, harems, or ritual roles, their intimacy with other women is less recorded. The sagas rarely mention it, perhaps because it did not threaten male honour in the same way. The silence does not mean it never happened, only that it lacked the same cultural weight. The focus remained on men, and on whether they dominated or submitted. I find it unsettling how fragile Viking masculinity was, resting on constant proof of dominance even in the most private acts. It reveals a society where men lived under relentless pressure, never free from judgment. The very act of intimacy, which elsewhere could be personal or comforting, was another test, another chance to win or lose respect. These rules may sound rigid, but they also created a space where intimacy between men existed openly, even proudly, as long as it followed the cultural code. This nuance complicates modern views of the Vikings, showing them as neither fully restrictive nor entirely free, but locked into their logic of power. Sexual roles in Viking culture show how deeply they tied intimacy to strength, dominance, and reputation. But their obsession with fertility and survival also shaped how women were judged, often reducing them to their ability to bear children rather than their beauty. The next part takes us into this harsh measure, where a woman's worth was decided not by her face, but by the children she could produce. In Viking society, the value of a young woman was often measured not by her face or charm, but by her ability to bear children. Fertility was considered the most important quality because children meant survival, continuation of family lines, and strength for the clan. Beauty as we think of it today, delicate features, slim bodies, or elegant looks, was secondary. What mattered most was whether a woman could produce healthy offspring. In a world where high mortality rates and constant conflict threatened the future, the womb became the true foundation of family honour. The ideal image of a bride was not a fragile figure but a body that looked ready for motherhood. Pale skin, which showed she had not been burned or marked by hard outdoor labour, was praised. Fullness of body was also valued because it was seen as a sign of health and strength. A woman who appeared thin or weak might be judged as incapable of carrying children. In this way, appearance was tied directly to fertility, not to personal attraction. It is almost cruelly ironic that while modern societies often glorify beauty standards detached from function, Viking men looked first at whether a woman could breed. There were even rituals meant to test fertility. In some communities, older women or elders of the household would place their hands on the belly of a girl to judge whether her body seemed ready for childbirth. This act was less about medical knowledge and more about cultural symbolism, but it carried weight. A girl who passed such tests could be quickly promised in marriage. A girl who failed might be overlooked, her worth diminished. The intrusion into her body was not questioned. It was treated as ordinary, just another step in arranging marriages. Once married, the pressure on women increased. A bride was expected to become pregnant quickly, ideally within the first year. If she did not conceive after one season, whispers began. After another year, her husband's family might openly question her usefulness. In some cases, a woman who did not bear children was sent back to her family or cast aside. The stigma of infertility was heavy, and it followed the woman more than the man. Rarely did people blame the husband. The burden of failure was placed almost entirely on the wife. This constant evaluation shaped how women lived their lives. Their daily routines, diets, and roles in the household revolved around preparing for and supporting motherhood. The ability to produce children was their shield and their status. A fertile woman could gain influence by bearing sons who would one day fight, raid, and inherit. A woman who struggled faced silence, suspicion, or dismissal, compared to modern times, where many women are free to define themselves outside of motherhood. Viking women were trapped in a cycle where their value ended if their womb failed them. The sagas include references to barren wives, often describing them with pity or disdain. These women sometimes disappeared from the story after their husbands remarried or took concubines. Others were humiliated, used as examples of failure. The absence of children not only weakened their marriage but also reduced their family standing. In a culture where alliances were built on blood, infertility was more than personal, it was political. Children themselves were considered wealth. A large household of sons and daughters meant strength and prosperity. Sons fought, daughters married into alliances, and all carried the family name forward. A woman who produced many children was celebrated. She might even gain a reputation for being blessed by the gods. Her womb seen as sacred. This created a clear hierarchy among women. Those who bore many children gained honour. Those who could not fell into obscurity. Archaeological evidence shows graves of women buried with symbols of fertility, amulets, carvings, or objects tied to motherhood. These suggest that women's roles as mothers were remembered even in death. Their legacy was not their beauty, but their ability to give life. In contrast, few artifacts emphasize female individuality or personal achievement outside motherhood. The pattern reflects the narrow expectations placed upon them. This relentless focus on fertility must have created emotional strain. Young brides carried not only the pressure of marriage, but also the looming judgment of pregnancy. Their bodies were watched, their bellies touched, their cycles monitored. The intimacy of reproduction became a public concern. Families, neighbours, and even strangers felt entitled to comment on their success or failure. Privacy did not exist in this regard. For some women, fertility brought power. A mother of many sons could become a matriarch, her opinions respected within the household. She might influence decisions, command loyalty, and hold sway even over her husband. But this power was conditional. It depended on her continued ability to produce and nurture children. If misfortune struck, such as the death of children or a barren period, her authority could vanish overnight. The preference for fertility over beauty also shaped how marriages were arranged. Men did not seek the most attractive bride in the modern sense. They sought the one most likely to bear many healthy children. Families boasted not about their daughters' looks, but about their strength and the lineage of mothers who had produced large households. Beauty may have caught the eye, but fertility secured the deal. This system left little room for romantic love. A woman who dreamed of affection or partnership often had those hopes crushed by the weight of expectation. She was chosen for her body's potential, not her mind or heart. Once married, her role was to fulfill that expectation. Those who failed rarely had a second chance. I often think about how lonely it must have been for women who wanted to be seen as more than wombs. Their songs, fears, and private desires are mostly lost to us, buried beneath stories told by men, yet they lived with the constant reality that their worth would be measured in children, not in laughter, skill, or kindness. This obsession with fertility fits the Viking worldview of survival. Every child born strengthened the clan. Every barren womb was a threat. In harsh environments where life was uncertain, the pressure to reproduce became overwhelming. That logic kept the system alive, even though it cost women their freedom and individuality. The evaluation of women through their wombs shows how practical and harsh Viking culture could be. It reduced half the population to reproductive function, stripping them of choice and dignity, and yet it was consistent with a society that measured everything by survival and strength. Beauty faded, but children endured. Fertility rituals and judgments were not the only way women were bound to gods and men. In some cases, their very first sexual experiences were taken not by choice, but as offerings to deities, carried out through temple rites. The next part leads us into those ceremonies of sacrifice, where virginity itself was given not to a husband but to the gods. In Viking belief, gods and goddesses were not distant figures. They were part of daily life, and their influence was felt in farming, warfare, and even in the most intimate aspects of human existence. Among the deities most closely tied to love and fertility was Freya. She was both feared and adored, worshipped as a goddess of beauty, desire, and magic. To serve her was considered an honour, but for many young women, that service came at a heavy cost. One of the most controversial practices connected to her worship was the ritual of offering virginity to the goddess, a tradition that shaped the lives of girls chosen for it. The ceremony was not a private act but a public declaration. Families could dedicate their daughters to Freya, often to gain favour or secure blessings for fertility and prosperity. Once chosen, the girl was brought to the temple where priests oversaw her initiation. This initiation almost always included sexual rites, not with the goddess herself, of course. but through her human representatives. The priest acted as the vessel of the divine, and through physical union, the girl was believed to be offering her purity directly to Freya. It is painfully ironic that what was described as devotion to a goddess of love was often the forced submission of a frightened young girl. After the first ritual, some girls were allowed to return to their families, marked forever as women who had served the goddess. Others remained in the temple and became what were sometimes described as sacred priestesses of Freya. These women lived apart from ordinary society, their lives controlled by the demands of the temple. They were not permitted to marry or to bear children. Their bodies were seen as belonging to the goddess, dedicated entirely to ritual service. For some, this meant continued participation in sexual ceremonies, where they would serve men who sought blessings through Freya's name. The temple itself functioned as both a place of worship and a place of ritual sexuality. Men who wanted fertility, prosperity, or even success in love might come to the temple and lie with one of Freya's priestesses. This act was framed not as lust but as sacred devotion, a way of channeling the goddess's power into their own lives. The priestesses were seen as bridges to the divine, their intimacy carrying spiritual meaning for the men they lay with. For the women, however, this often meant a lifetime of sexual servitude under the label of holiness. Unlike marriage, where a woman could gain some influence through childbearing or managing a household, priestesses had little autonomy. They were revered publicly, but isolated privately. Their roles were fixed, and their futures were determined at the moment they were given to the temple. For families, dedicating a daughter could raise their status or win the favour of the gods. For the daughter, it ended any hope of choosing her path. The sagas and later accounts mention these practices with varying tones. Some describe them as noble, praising the priestesses as holy servants of Freya. Others, especially after Christianity spread, condemned them as immoral. Regardless of how they were judged, the fact that they were remembered at all shows how central sexuality was in Norse worship. To honour Freya without sexual rites would have seemed incomplete. The expectation that priestesses remain unmarried and childless highlights a contradiction. Freya was the goddess of fertility, yet the women who served her were forbidden from bearing children themselves. Their fertility was redirected toward ritual rather than family. This paradox underscores how Viking spirituality often bent human lives into symbolic roles. The woman's womb, normally valued above all, was in this case suppressed to serve a higher purpose. Compared to modern societies, where religious service is usually separated from sexuality, the Vikings merged the two until they were almost indistinguishable. The emotional weight of this service is difficult to recover, since the voices of these women are absent from the sources. We do not know if some embraced their role with pride or if most felt trapped. What is clear is that their lives were shaped entirely by forces outside their control. From the moment of dedication, their destiny was sealed, their bodies no longer their own. Communities may have seen them as necessary sacrifices. By giving their daughters, families demonstrated devotion to Freya, hoping to secure divine favour for crops, livestock, and future generations. In this way, the women became offerings, living symbols of faith. Their personal desires were considered unimportant compared to the well-being of the community. This reflects the Viking worldview, where individual suffering was acceptable if it meant collective survival. Some accounts also suggest that these rites served practical purposes for temple authorities. By controlling women dedicated to Freya, priests gained both influence and wealth. Pilgrims brought offerings, hoping to secure blessings through ritual intimacy. The temple benefited, the priests gained power, and the families earned prestige. The women themselves, however, had little to gain. Their honour came at the cost of freedom. The practice also reveals how Viking culture blurred the line between worship and sexuality. What might look like exploitation to us was, in their eyes, a spiritual necessity. They did not divide the sacred from the sensual. Instead, they saw sexuality as a direct channel to divine power. This perspective allowed acts that might have been condemned elsewhere to be sanctified. Archaeological findings suggest temples to fertility deities included carvings and symbols that emphasize sexuality. Phallic stones, figurines, and fertility icons appear across Norse sites, reinforcing the connection between reproduction and worship. While these do not prove specific rituals, they align with the written accounts that describe priestesses and sexual rites. For the women involved, life in the temple was both visible and invisible. Everyone knew their role, yet their personal voices were erased. They were celebrated as holy but treated as tools. Their legacy lives on not through their own words but through stories told by others. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine these women standing as symbols of love and beauty while being denied the chance to love themselves freely. The offering of virginity to Freya represents a striking example of how Viking culture placed spiritual needs above individual ones. It shows how sexuality was woven into worship, not as sin but as service. It also reminds us that behind every sacred story were real women whose lives were sacrificed for faith. The link between sexuality and ritual was not limited to Freya's temples. In some communities, marriage itself could be sealed not with rings or vows but with blood, turning union into a sacred act witnessed by gods. The next part takes us into these strange customs, where couples mixed blood and sex to prove their marriages to the divine. Marriage among the Vikings was never only a matter of social agreement, it was also a matter of sacred recognition. Beyond the exchange of dowries or the approval of families, some communities believed that a marriage could only be considered real if it was sanctified by blood. This belief tied human intimacy directly to the gods, turning private union into a ritual act of sacrifice. Blood, the substance that symbolized life and death, was thought to be the only proof strong enough to carry a vow into the spiritual world. Without it, no oath was binding. The ritual of mixing blood into a drink was one of the most recognized forms of this practice. A man and a woman about to marry would cut themselves, often on the hand or arm, and let their blood flow into a cup of mead or wine. They would drink it together, consuming each other's life force, binding themselves with a symbol far stronger than words. This act was more than symbolic. For them, it was literal. The blood carried their essence, and by sharing it, they created one body, one life, one union. It is strangely ironic that while modern weddings rely on papers and rings, the Vikings sealed their marriages with wounds and blood. But the ritual did not stop with drinking. In some accounts, the couple would then lie together on the ground, often on soil stained with their blood. This was the moment when the union was truly confirmed. To shed blood, to share it, and to join sexually upon it was to prove themselves before the gods. Only then could the marriage be acknowledged as sacred. Without this act, the union was seen as incomplete, even illegitimate. The combination of blood and sex carried immense symbolic weight. Blood represented sacrifice and life. Sex represented fertility and continuity. Together, they formed the ultimate offering, tying human love to divine approval. For the Vikings, the act was not private. It was often performed with witnesses present, sometimes even with priests overseeing the ritual. What we would consider deeply intimate was, in their culture, a necessary public proof. The seriousness of this ritual also reveals how Vikings understood promises. Words alone were not enough. They believed that only physical acts, bloodshed and flesh joined, could bind two people in a way the gods respected. This fits with their wider culture, where oaths were often sealed with blood, and promises broken could lead to curses. Marriage was no different. To be real, it had to be marked in blood. For women, this ritual carried both weight and risk. The shedding of blood could be dangerous, especially if the cut became infected. The expectation to prove marriage through sex on the same grounds added physical and emotional pressure, yet refusal was not an option. the ritual was seen as sacred law. A woman who did not complete it might be accused of defying the gods, placing her entire family under suspicion. Men also bore responsibility, but the burden was different. Their role was to provide strength, to cut themselves boldly, and to perform without hesitation. A hesitant groom risked mockery, while a hesitant bride risked disgrace. The ritual demanded courage, both in pain and in exposure. The sagas mention blood vows in contexts beyond marriage. Warriors swore brotherhood with shared blood. Leaders sealed alliances with the same act. By tying marriage to this broader tradition, the Vikings placed it in the same category as war pacts and political treaties. A marriage was not just personal, it was a binding contract on the same level as any other oath, with blood as its foundation. Archaeological evidence supports the importance of blood in rituals. Carvings and ceremonial objects depict bloodletting, sacrifice, and vessels for drink. While we cannot see couples on stained soil, the consistency of sagas, rituals, and artifacts suggests these practices were real. The emphasis on blood throughout Viking religion makes it plausible that marriages, too, were bound by it. Communities benefited from such ceremonies. A blood marriage was harder to break, carrying more weight than an ordinary union. Families could rely on the gods to enforce fidelity and duty. A man who abandoned his wife or a woman who left her husband would not only face social consequences but spiritual ones. To break a blood bond was to risk divine punishment. This fear held couples together, ensuring stability. At the same time, this ritual left little room for love or personal choice. It transformed intimacy into obligation. Couples might not know each other well, but once blood was shared, they were bound. Their private desires were irrelevant compared to the public weight of the ritual. Marriage became less about affection and more about duty, enforced by gods and community alike. Compared to today's marriages, where consent and love are often central, Viking blood marriages were brutal in their certainty. They left no room for doubt. Once the ritual was complete, the bond was unbreakable, no matter the feelings of the individuals. This reveals how little space there was for personal freedom in such a system. The ritual of sex on bloodied ground also shows how differently the Vikings viewed the body. For them, pain and pleasure were two sides of the same coin. To bleed and then to join in intimacy was not contradictory but complementary. Both acts released life force, and both were sacred. This perspective tied suffering and joy together in ways modern thought rarely accepts. I often think about how strange and heavy such a ritual must have felt for the young women and men involved. It is disturbing to imagine two people expected to prove their union by bleeding into the soil and lying together as their community watched. Yet for them, it was normal, a tradition carried through generations. To refuse would have meant disgrace. To accept meant stepping fully into the cycle of survival and faith. Blood marriages remind us how deeply Viking culture fused survival, religion, and intimacy. Nothing was left private or optional. Everything had to be sanctified, tested, and proven. In this way, even love became a sacrifice, bound in blood to the gods who watched from above. Yet while blood was one way to prove loyalty, the Vikings also believed that sex itself could be used for oaths of allegiance beyond marriage. Warriors and clans sometimes sealed pacts not with blades or handshakes, but with shared intimacy. The next part takes us into these unusual vows, where sex itself became a form of swearing loyalty stronger than any spoken word. Among the Vikings, words alone were rarely trusted. Oaths had to be proven, and promises were often sealed with blood, sacrifice, or some other act that carried real weight. For them, trust came not from speech but from actions that could not be faked. In many cases, warriors and families chose to bind themselves together through sex, using physical union as the ultimate proof of loyalty. These rituals may seem shocking to us today, but in their culture, they made sense. Sex was not only about pleasure or reproduction, It was a force of life and power, strong enough to bind clans and individuals under the eyes of the gods. Two people might choose to seal a bond by lying together, declaring that their bodies were now united in loyalty as well as in flesh. This act was seen as far more permanent than words, just as blood spilled in an oath made a promise unbreakable. So too did sexual union create a tie that could not easily be denied. Warriors swore to fight side by side until death, and lovers pledged to remain faithful by using their bodies as proof. It is oddly ironic that while many societies swore oaths on holy texts or relics, Vikings sometimes swore them in bed. The idea of using sex as an oath extended beyond couples. Clans and tribes could also arrange such ceremonies as part of peace treaties or alliances. Leaders and their chosen representatives would participate in ritual intimacy, sometimes with priestesses guiding the act, sometimes with multiple participants joining in to represent the unification of families. To them, the act was not debauchery. It was sacred, a form of spiritual contract. The gods were believed to witness the union and punish anyone who broke the vow. In some cases, these ceremonies involved more than two people. Group sexual rites could be carried out when two rival families or clans wished to cleanse divisions and begin anew. The shared act was considered a way of dissolving old hatred and binding everyone present into one body. To share intimacy was to erase boundaries, washing away conflict in the most literal sense. Outsiders might have seen chaos, but to the participants, it was order restored. The sagas contain fragments that describe such vows. They do not always go into detail, but they speak of men and women pledging loyalty through physical acts, and of treaties being sanctified with sex. Christian writers who later described Viking customs condemned these practices as obscene, but their outrage confirms that the ceremonies were real enough to survive in memory. If they had been rare or imaginary, they would not have drawn such attention. What strikes modern readers is the way intimacy was removed from the private sphere and turned into a public tool. Sex was not only for desire or for children, it was a weapon, a bridge, a ritual act as binding as spilling blood. This perspective reveals how differently the Vikings saw the human body. For them, flesh was another language for promises. Participation in such rituals carried weight for men and women alike. Men proved their dominance, not just in battle, but in loyalty. Women became symbols of unity, their bodies serving as bridges between clans. While this role gave them visibility, it also stripped them of choice. Many women had no say in whether they would be used as symbols in these ceremonies. Their duty to family and gods outweighed personal desire. Still, it would be wrong to see all of these acts as purely forced. In some cases, individuals may have embraced the role, proud to be part of such important rituals. Their names may have been remembered as those who carried peace into the community, but for others, the experience must have been heavy, their private lives consumed by the needs of clans and treaties. The spiritual aspect of these vows cannot be overlooked. The Vikings believed the gods were present during such acts, just as they were during sacrifices of blood or animals. To swear with sex was to involve divine witnesses directly. Breaking such an oath was unthinkable. It would bring not only social shame, but divine wrath. This fear held people to their word more tightly than any law could. Compared to modern societies, where intimacy is treated as private and sacred in personal terms, the Viking use of sex as an oath shows how public and functional it could become when survival demanded it. Love and desire were secondary. What mattered was loyalty and order, enforced through the strongest proof they knew. The group ceremonies must have been especially powerful, binding not only two people but entire communities. To watch and to join in created a shared memory that reinforced unity. Everyone present was part of the vow, whether as participant or witness. The act was unforgettable, ensuring that no one could later claim ignorance or deny the agreement. Archaeological hints, such as fertility symbols at gathering sites and carvings of ritual intimacy, suggest that these practices were more than legend. While we cannot know every detail, The consistency of accounts across sources paints a clear picture. Sexuality was tied to loyalty, just as it was tied to fertility and sacrifice. For individuals, these oaths blurred the lines between personal and communal identity. To share a body and ritual was to surrender part of oneself for the good of the clan. It was not only about affection or desire, but about becoming a tool of survival. This demand reveals the harshness of Viking life, where everything was measured by its contribution to the whole. I find it remarkable and disturbing that Vikings trusted sex more than words when it came to loyalty. To them, intimacy was stronger than speech, and a promise meant nothing unless it was proven through flesh. This view reshapes how we understand their culture, reminding us that even the most personal acts were often claimed by the needs of the community. These sexual oaths reveal a society where nothing was private and where survival justified every demand. They remind us how fragile trust was, and how far people were expected to go to secure it. Oaths sealed with sex were only one way the Vikings believed the divine entered human lives. They also thought that during climax, gods themselves could inhabit the body, turning intimacy into a moment of possession. Flesh was not only for survival or loyalty, it could also become the doorway through which gods stepped into the world. This belief carried them into rituals where sex was not about humans at all, but about making space for the divine to take hold. For the Vikings, sex was never just about the body. It carried weight far beyond pleasure, marriage, or survival. They believed that during the most intimate act, especially at the peak of orgasm, the line between human and divine could vanish. In those moments, gods and spirits were thought to step into the body, taking hold of flesh and mind. This belief gave intimacy a spiritual depth that shaped how they practiced and understood it. To them, climax was not only a release of energy, but a door opening to the other world. Women in particular were often described in sagas and oral traditions as experiencing possession during sex. Some said they felt overtaken by forces larger than themselves, voices or visions filling their minds at the height of pleasure. This was interpreted not as madness but as a sacred moment where divine presence entered. Men, too, could be seen as vessels, though the focus in many accounts is on women as the receivers of power. Their bodies became channels through which gods might act or speak. It is strangely ironic that while modern people might describe climax in terms of science and hormones, Vikings saw it as proof of a god stepping inside. The rituals built around this belief were direct and striking. Some communities held ceremonies where couples were expected to join sexually before an altar. This was known in some traditions as an act of creating a god. The idea was that their climax, shared in a sacred place, would open a path for divine presence. The gods were not distant. They could enter worshippers directly, inhabiting their flesh in the heat of union. To them, this was not sacrilege but devotion. Priests and priestesses often oversaw such ceremonies, guiding chants and prayers while couples performed the act. The climax was considered the high point of the ritual, the moment when divine energy was strongest. Spectators might join in chanting or drumming, adding rhythm and intensity to the act. What appears shocking to us today was, in their eyes, another way to keep balance between human life and the gods who controlled it. The belief that orgasm allowed possession reflected the Viking understanding of power. They saw life force as something that flowed and could be shared, given, or taken. Just as blood carried spiritual weight, so too did sexual release. To climax was to open the body's gates, and through those gates, spirits could pass. This is why people described feeling controlled or overwhelmed during sex. It was interpreted not as loss of self, but as sacred surrender. This belief gave sex a terrifying and holy weight. To sleep with someone was not only to share bodies, but to risk inviting divine forces. It explains why some sagas tell of women who claimed visions or strange powers after certain encounters. They were seen as touched by the gods, marked forever by having been entered not only by men but by spirits. The role of women in these rituals was both honoured and exploited. On one hand, to be chosen as a vessel meant being close to the gods, revered for the power within them. On the other hand, it stripped them of control. Their bodies were expected to serve as doors, their will overridden by divine or communal demand. This duality is visible in how sagas both celebrate and silence such women. They are remembered for the spirits they carried, not for themselves. Men, too, risked possession, but their cultural role focused more on dominance. If a man claimed that a god entered him during climax, it was framed as a gift of power. If a woman said the same, it was often seen as confirmation that her body had been claimed for ritual use. The balance between honour and subjugation depended on gender. Communal ceremonies reinforced these ideas. In some cases, multiple couples participated at once, turning the entire event into a frenzy of flesh, chant, and supposed divine possession. The belief was that the gods required not only the sacrifice of animals or blood, but also the surrender of human bodies in intimacy. The community joined together in trust that these acts secured fertility, health, or victory. Compared to modern views of intimacy as private, the Viking approach seems both alien and brutal. They treated sex as public property when gods were involved, a tool that could open spiritual doors. Pleasure was not condemned, but it was redirected, turned into proof of devotion. This stripped individuals of privacy but gave the act cosmic meaning. Some archaeological sites may hint at these practices: temples with fertility symbols, carvings of couples joined before altars, and objects tied to ritual sexuality suggest that stories of possession were more than myth. The consistency across sources strengthens the case that this belief shaped real lives. The fear of spirits entering during climax also meant that intimacy carried risk. Just as people prayed to gods for blessings, they also feared hostile forces. Not all spirits were benevolent. Some believed that if rituals were done wrongly, malevolent beings could take hold instead. This added another layer of tension, making sex both sacred and dangerous. I often think about the emotional impact this must have had on individuals. It is unsettling to imagine someone taught to believe that every moment of climax might mean surrendering their body to powers beyond their control. What for us is private and personal was for them a cosmic event, heavy with meaning and fear. The blending of sexuality and spirit possession shows again how Vikings refused to separate body from faith. Everything physical was also spiritual. Every act was another chance to interact with the gods. In this way, sex became more than desire or duty. It was an open gate to the other world. Belief in divine possession through climax also explains why some leaders used these rituals to strengthen their authority. If a priestess claimed that Freya entered her body, her words carried divine weight. If a chieftain claimed Odin filled him during union, his commands could be treated as holy. In this sense, possession was political, giving spiritual justification for power. These practices make it clear how little privacy the Vikings allowed individuals. Even the most intimate moments could be claimed by gods, priests, or the community. To live in that world was to accept that your body was never fully your own. It was always part of a larger system of survival, faith, and control. Sex as possession may sound extreme, but in Viking thought it fit naturally into their cycle of rituals. Blood, pain, pleasure, and climax were all bridges to the divine. They did not fear mixing them. They embraced the idea that suffering and joy alike could call down gods. This belief also influenced their view of leadership. A ruler who claimed divine presence through sex had proof of closeness to the gods. It was not enough to fight or speak well. To be truly respected, some leaders may have pointed to possession as evidence of divine favour. For the Vikings, climax was never simple. It was a moment when the walls between worlds dissolved. Whether terrifying or empowering, it was treated as sacred. Yet even with this heavy belief in spirits entering the body, sex was also used more practically as a sign of dominance and status. Leaders and chieftains often claimed rights over women as proof of power. This turn from possession to privilege shows how intimacy was also a weapon of authority, where a man's reach extended not just over land but over every bed he could claim. In Viking society, power was not only measured by land, wealth, or victories in battle, it was also measured by control over intimacy. Sexual rights and privileges were deeply tied to rank, and the act itself was treated as a public marker of strength. A man who had many women was respected, not condemned, because his virility was seen as proof of his authority. Women, too, if they held high positions or extraordinary courage, could use sexual freedom to demonstrate their dominance. Intimacy, in this sense, became another weapon in the constant competition for status. One of the most disturbing customs that shows this connection between sex and power was the so-called rite of the first night. In some communities, the chieftain could claim sexual access to every new bride before her husband did. This act was not hidden. It was seen as the natural privilege of leadership, a demonstration that the chief stood above all other men. The bride's body became a stage where power was confirmed. Families tolerated this practice not because they approved of it, but because challenging it meant challenging the entire hierarchy of the village. It is grimly ironic that what was called leadership often looked more like exploitation. For ordinary men, sexual conquest was also tied to reputation. A warrior who boasted of many lovers was admired as strong and desirable. To have multiple partners was proof that he could dominate not only in battle but in bed. The connection was direct. More women meant more prestige. Tales and sagas often praised men not just for their victories but for their lovers, turning intimacy into another form of glory. A man who failed to attract partners might be mocked as weak, unworthy of honour. Women, though often restricted by marriage arrangements, also had pathways to sexual power. A woman of high rank, such as the wife of a chieftain or a renowned shield maiden, could choose lovers openly. Her choices were respected, even feared, because they reflected her strength. To be rejected by such a woman could be humiliating for a man, and in some cases, dangerous. Some women gathered harems of their own, surrounding themselves with lovers as proof that they stood above ordinary expectations. This behaviour was unusual, but when it occurred, it was celebrated rather than condemned. Compared to modern societies, where women are often judged harshly for multiple partners, Viking women of power could be praised for the very same thing. The connection between sex and authority also extended to rituals. Leaders were sometimes expected to perform sexually in ceremonies that symbolized fertility or unity. Their ability to do so in public, under pressure, was proof of strength. A failed performance could harm their reputation just as much as a lost battle. Success, however, reinforced their dominance not only over people but over the spiritual order as well. This expectation created enormous pressure on both men and women. Men had to continually prove their virility to maintain respect. Women of rank had to balance between using their freedom and avoiding suspicion. Their bodies were never entirely private, always subject to interpretation as symbols of power. The sagas contain stories of leaders gifting women to allies or rivals, using intimacy as a bargaining tool. Wives and daughters could be exchanged not only for marriage alliances but also as tokens of loyalty. In these cases, the women's desires were ignored. Their value lay in their ability to serve as symbols of wealth and generosity. To give a woman was to show that one had so many that one could afford to part with them. This logic treated intimacy as currency, reducing human relationships to transactions of prestige. For the warriors who surrounded a chieftain, proximity to his sexual privileges reinforced hierarchy. The chief claimed the best, the first, the most. His men followed with what remained. This pattern mirrored the spoils of battle, where the leader took the richest share. The link between war and sex was not accidental. Both were arenas where dominance had to be proved and reaffirmed. Yet, for all the harshness of this system, it also created unexpected opportunities for women of exceptional character. A woman who commanded respect could flip the script, using her body to demonstrate independence and strength. Her multiple lovers became symbols of defiance against the ordinary order, and instead of being shamed, she was sometimes compared to goddesses like Freya, whose own myth celebrated sexual freedom. I cannot help but think how different this is from later centuries, where women's freedom was almost always punished rather than admired. The public nature of sexual power in Viking life shows again how little they separated private and communal spheres. What we might think of as intimate and personal was, for them, another stage where strength was displayed. A chief who could not claim the right of the first night risked looking weak. A warrior who had few lovers risked mockery. A woman who never bore lovers risked invisibility. Everything was tied to status. This obsession with virility and dominance also carried dangers. Competition among men sometimes erupted into violence, fueled by jealousy or insult. To accuse a man of lacking sexual strength was as damaging as accusing him of cowardice in battle. The two were linked, both tied to the same vision of masculinity. For women, sexual boldness could protect them, but it also placed them in constant danger of rivalry among men. Intimacy was never safe. It was always political. Archaeological evidence, from carvings of exaggerated male symbols to burial goods linked with fertility, reinforces the centrality of sex as proof of power. These symbols were not hidden away. They were displayed proudly, signalling how much virility mattered to Viking identity. Leadership, honor, and sexuality were threads of the same fabric. Looking back, it is clear that Viking culture turned intimacy into a tool of control and competition. What we might see as private choice was, for them, another form of performance. Their world measured strength by how much one could take: land, wealth, lives, and even lovers. But in this world where sex was power, even children were not shielded from witnessing or participating in its presence. In some communities, the young were exposed early, treated as ready long before we would consider them so today. This brings us to one of the harshest realities of Viking life, where childhood and innocence were often cut short in ways that seem unthinkable now. In Viking culture, childhood as we understand it today barely existed. The line between being a child and being an adult was blurred, often erased altogether. Sexuality, which in many societies is hidden from the young, was in their world visible and sometimes unavoidable. Children grew up watching rituals, hearing sagas, and witnessing acts that were treated as normal, even sacred, but which to modern eyes appeared deeply troubling. In their villages and halls, intimacy was not locked behind closed doors. It was woven into daily life, and children absorbed it as part of their earliest experiences. One of the starkest differences lay in the visibility of sex. Couples did not always separate themselves from children, and in ritual contexts they could not. A child might see their parents engaged in intimacy, not because it was considered corrupting, but because it was treated as a natural part of life. In ceremonies meant to honor fertility, sexual acts could take place publicly, with families and neighbors present. Children were included in these gatherings as members of the community. There was no effort to shield their eyes. To the Vikings, there was nothing to hide. It is bitterly ironic that while modern societies argue fiercely over shielding children from even modest depictions of sex, Viking children grew up watching it unfold before them. The expectation that children would accept this without question reflects the Viking view of survival. Sexuality was not shameful. It was central to keeping the clan alive. Crops, livestock, and human families all depended on fertility. To keep those forces strong, rituals had to involve everyone, and everyone included the young. To exclude children would have been to cut them off from the rhythm of survival. What we might call innocence was, in their eyes, ignorance. Girls, in particular, faced pressures that eliminated the concept of adolescence. A girl could be married before puberty if she was considered tall enough or physically ready. The standard was not age, but appearance and utility. Families might promise daughters while they were still very young, arranging unions that secured alliances or wealth. A girl who had barely entered her teens might be sent to a husband, expected to bear children soon after. In this way, childhood was shortened, turned into a brief stage before adult responsibilities arrived. The sagas and scattered accounts hint at these practices, though they often describe them in neutral or even celebratory tones. A girl's early marriage was framed as proof of her family's strength and her value. Her body was treated as a resource, a way of securing prosperity for the clan. Love and choice rarely entered the equation. For the child herself, there was no space for delay, no pause to discover who she was. Her path was chosen by height, by womb, by the demands of survival. Boys also grew up quickly, though in different ways. From a young age, they were exposed to sexual talk, jokes, and rituals. They were expected to learn by observation, listening to older men boast of their lovers, or watching rituals where intimacy played a role. A boy's transition to adulthood often came through his first sexual experiences, which might be arranged by older family members or through encounters with slaves. These were not treated as private explorations, but as milestones in proving manhood. The result was a society where innocence was not a value. Experience, even too early experience, was seen as a strength. A child who witnessed acts of intimacy or who was drawn into adult responsibilities was simply becoming part of the cycle sooner. Compared to modern times, where long years of childhood and adolescence are protected and extended, Viking life forced the young into adulthood almost as soon as their bodies allowed it. The lack of separation between childhood and adulthood also shows up in language. Norse terms for young people often shifted quickly to adult roles, with little vocabulary for the in-between stages. This reflects how society saw them not as children to be sheltered, but as future warriors and mothers in training. Their exposure to sex, violence, and survival was preparation, not corruption. Yet the costs of this approach were severe. Girls who married too early risked health complications from childbirth. Boys pushed into manhood often carried heavy emotional scars. The cultural expectation that children were ready long before they truly were left no space for vulnerability. Weakness was not tolerated, and those who faltered risked shame or neglect. Archaeological evidence supports this harsh reality. Graves of young girls sometimes show them buried with marriage goods, proof that they were treated as wives before they reached maturity. Boys' graves often contain weapons, showing that even in death they were remembered as men rather than children. The absence of objects that reflect childhood play underscores how little value was placed on a prolonged youth. Community rituals reinforce these roles. A young girl present at a fertility rite would be reminded of her future as a wife and mother. A boy who watched warriors boast of their lovers would be reminded of his duty to prove himself in the same way. The cycle repeated without pause. Each generation thrust into adult responsibilities at an age we would now call tender. I cannot help but feel sorrow for the Viking children whose lives were shaped before they even had the chance to choose. To grow up with no space for innocence, no years of shelter, must have weighed heavily, even if they did not have the words to describe it. Their world allowed no delay. They were part of the survival machine from the moment they could walk. This openness to exposing children to sex also carried spiritual dimensions. If fertility rituals were considered holy, then children's presence was not inappropriate. It was educational. They were being raised inside the sacred cycle, prepared to continue it when their time came. This logic explains why parents and priests alike had no qualms about exposing them. It was not abuse in their eyes, it was duty. By looking at this aspect of Viking culture, we see again how survival shaped morality. What we would call exploitation, they called preparation. what we would call innocence, they called weakness. The children of that world did not have the luxury of waiting. This harsh upbringing laid the foundation for the entire culture. A society that forced children to grow fast was a society always ready for war, for famine, for struggle. But it was also a society that paid the price in broken lives and lost youth. Even death did not shield children from these roles. Some communities practiced rituals in which a dead child could be married symbolically, joining them to another soul or family. This belief in binding even the dead to adult roles reveals just how far the Vikings went in erasing the boundaries of childhood. Among the more unsettling practices recorded in parts of Viking culture was the ritual of marrying the dead. While it was not common everywhere, enough traces appear in sagas and later accounts to suggest that some communities believed in it. The custom often arose when a woman died unmarried, especially if her death was considered untimely or dishonourable. Remaining unwed was sometimes thought to trap her soul, leaving it restless and unable to pass fully into the afterlife. To solve this problem, families would arrange a symbolic marriage between the deceased and a living man, or in rare cases, between two dead individuals. The purpose was not love or companionship, but the cleansing of impurity and the restoration of balance. The ritual could vary, but the central idea was always the same: the dead must not remain outside the social order. If life demanded marriage, then death did too. A woman who died unmarried was seen as incomplete, her spirit unsettled, her family stained with shame. To erase this stigma, a marriage was staged, often with the body present. Relatives and community members gathered, bringing gifts or livestock as offerings. These were not wedding presents in the usual sense, but payments to appease the gods and free the spirit. It is grimly ironic that while today we see marriage as a choice between two people, some Viking families saw it as an obligation that even death could not cancel. In some accounts, the ceremony was purely symbolic. The corpse might be dressed in bridal clothing laid on a bed or platform, while rituals were performed to declare her wedded. The groom, if alive, might stand beside the body or even lie next to it. In other, more disturbing descriptions, there are hints that physical acts of intimacy could occur, either performed by the groom or enacted through symbolic gestures. Whether literal or metaphorical, these acts were intended to bind the living and the dead, ensuring that the woman was no longer a dishonoured maiden, but a married soul released to the afterlife. The presence of sexual elements in these ceremonies shocks modern readers, but to the Vikings, they were not grotesque, they were logical. Sex was the ultimate act of union, and without it, marriage was incomplete. To show that even a dead bride had crossed this threshold was to fulfill the social and spiritual expectation. To us, it looks like desecration. To them, it was a necessary completion. The family played a central role in arranging and financing the ritual. They provided gifts, food, or livestock, often paying them as offerings to the gods or compensation to the groom's family. This payment served both practical and spiritual purposes. It cleansed the shame of having an unmarried daughter, and it brought the release of her soul from the burden of incompleteness. Families may have struggled under the weight of these expectations, but refusal to perform the ritual would have been seen as dishonourable. Communities accepted these marriages as normal when they occurred. People attended the ceremonies, shared in the feasts, and spoke of the dead bride as though she had been truly married. The living groom, if present, might gain status from the act, seen as someone willing to restore order and take on the burden of cleansing. In this way, what might look humiliating could instead raise his standing. The sagas and later Christian writers who described these practices often treated them with scorn, condemning them as barbaric. But their criticisms serve as indirect confirmation that the rituals were real. If they had been invented, they would not have drawn such disgust. Archaeological evidence also suggests some link. Graves of young women have been found with bridal ornaments, though there is no sign of a living husband. These burials fit the idea that the woman was married after death, her soul released through the ritual, compared to modern practices where funerals are about remembrance and mourning. The Viking merging of weddings with burials shows how blurred their boundaries between life and death were. Marriage was not about happiness, but about order, and order was considered more important than comfort. For the individuals involved, these rituals must have been emotionally heavy. Families grieving a daughter's death also had to prepare her for marriage. A groom, living or symbolic, had to join himself to someone who could not answer. The community witnessed it all, not as tragedy, but as duty fulfilled. In their worldview, failing to marry the dead would bring greater sorrow, inviting misfortune and divine displeasure. The presence of sexual acts, whether symbolic or real, underscores again how deeply sexuality was tied to Viking spirituality. It was not reserved for the living. It was considered a universal language, able to reach across the boundary of death. To them, a woman's body was not free even in the grave. It remained a vessel for ritual, another tool for the community's survival and honour. I find it disturbing to imagine a grieving family forced to stage a wedding for their dead daughter, treating her body as both bride and symbol. Yet in their eyes, this was mercy, not cruelty. It allowed her to move on and lifted the stain from their name. It was a harsh reminder that individuality mattered little compared to the needs of order and tradition. This ritual also highlights the Viking fear of disorder. An unmarried woman's spirit was a loose thread, and loose threads threatened the whole fabric of the clan. By tying her into the cycle of marriage, even after death, they restored what was broken. The price was high, but for them, the cost of leaving it undone was higher still. As grim as these rituals were, they were not the most forbidden acts the Vikings performed. In some places, sex itself was used in ceremonies that crossed boundaries between humans and animals, blending desire, fear, and worship. From binding the dead to binding with beasts, the extremes of Viking ritual show just how far they were willing to go in treating sex as the bridge between worlds. Among the most disturbing and controversial practices attributed to the Vikings are the rituals that involved humans and animals in acts of sexual union. These ceremonies are difficult to pin down, and scholars still debate whether they were purely symbolic, exaggerated by hostile chroniclers, or sometimes performed in reality. Yet they appear often enough in scattered sources to suggest that the belief in such acts was genuine, even if the exact details are uncertain. What makes them striking is not only the taboo they represent, but also the way the Vikings seem to see no separation between human flesh, animal flesh, and divine presence when it came to ritual. For them, sex was a bridge across all boundaries, and that included the boundary between species. Some accounts describe women or men being joined with sacred animals, such as horses or goats, as part of fertility ceremonies. The animal was not seen merely as a beast, but as a vessel of divine energy. By joining with it, the participant was believed to merge with the god it represented. The act was thought to sanctify the soil, bless the crops, or ensure prosperity for the clan. While to us this appears grotesque, to the Vikings it was simply another form of sacrifice, a surrender of the body to forces larger than the self. It is unsettlingly ironic that while modern societies might look to prayers or offerings for good harvests, some Viking communities thought lying with an animal could secure the same result. Whether these unions were literal or symbolic remains uncertain. Some rituals may have staged the act without completing it, using gestures and positioning to give the impression of union while avoiding it in reality. Others, however, may have crossed that line. The boundary between symbol and practice was often thin in Viking culture, and when survival was at stake, nothing was ruled out. A failed harvest could mean famine. In that context, even the most extreme rituals could be justified. Participants in these ceremonies were often chosen carefully. They might be priestesses, slaves, or individuals considered especially close to the divine. Their role was both honoured and exploited. On one hand, to serve as the vessel in such a ritual was to be marked as a bridge between humans and gods, a sacred role that carried immense spiritual weight, On the other hand, it stripped the person of choice, turning their body into an instrument for communal survival. Families and clans might pressure individuals into these roles, presenting them as sacrifices for the greater good. Men and women both appear in these accounts, though the focus is often on women. In some traditions, a woman lying with a stallion or goat was believed to channel fertility into the land. In others, men were said to perform acts with sacred animals as proof of their closeness to gods like Freya, who himself was often associated with fertility and animal power. These ceremonies blurred every line we take for granted today, mixing sex, religion, and survival into a single act that defies modern categories. The community did not treat these rituals as shameful. On the contrary, they were sometimes public, with witnesses gathered to see the act completed. This visibility reinforced the idea that the ritual was not about personal desire but about collective benefit. To hide it would have undermined its sacred weight. Just as blood sacrifices were carried out in the open, so too were acts of sexual union with animals treated as something that belonged to the whole community. Sources that describe these practices often come from Christian chroniclers who despised the Vikings. Some may have exaggerated or misrepresented what they saw. But even hostile accounts carry truth when repeated across multiple places and times. Archaeological hints, such as carvings of animals linked with fertility rites, also suggest that some form of ritual connection between humans and animals existed. The exact nature may never be fully known, but the consistent association is difficult to ignore. The logic behind these practices reflects the Viking worldview. Animals were not inferior creatures to them. They were companions in survival, symbols of gods, and sometimes seen as direct vessels of divine force. To join with an animal was to join with the divine, not to degrade oneself. This perspective helps explain why people accepted these acts without the disgust we feel today. Compared to our modern sense of species boundaries, the Viking belief that humans and animals could merge spiritually makes their rituals appear both alien and brutal. Yet the consequences for participants must have been heavy. A woman chosen to lie with an animal might be praised as holy, but she also carried the burden of being forever marked by the act. A man who performed such a ritual might gain status as a vessel of divine power, but he, too, lived with the memory of what he had done. In their society, however, personal burden mattered less than communal survival. The needs of the group outweighed the feelings of the individual. I cannot help but imagine the fear or resignation of those pushed into these roles. It is chilling to think of someone standing before their entire community, expected to merge with an animal while everyone watched, told that their act would bring fertility to the land. What we see as humiliation was, for them, sanctity. That inversion of meaning reveals how different their values were and how survival shaped what was considered acceptable. The sagas rarely describe these ceremonies in detail, but their silence may be telling. Some practices were too sacred or too shameful to record directly. Instead, fragments appear in myths, such as the associations of gods with animals and fertility, or in Christian condemnations that accused pagans of bestiality during rituals. These fragments together create a picture that is hard to dismiss. Rituals of this kind also highlight the Viking willingness to cross any boundary in pursuit of power. If sex could bring the gods closer, then no partner was too strange, no act too extreme. The human body was simply another tool to be used in whatever way the gods demanded. That logic, carried to its limits, erased the line between human and animal. The practice also shows the danger of absolute belief in divine necessity. When people are convinced that the gods demand something, they will do it, no matter how extreme. The Vikings, like many ancient cultures, saw themselves as constantly negotiating with the divine. Every harvest, every storm, every battle depended on keeping the gods pleased. If lying with an animal could achieve that, then it would become not only acceptable, but essential. This readiness to use sex in every possible form underscores the core of Viking spirituality survival at all costs, and union with the divine by any means, whether through blood, through group rituals, through possession, or through crossing the boundaries of species. Their culture treated intimacy as a universal bridge. As disturbing as these practices are, they fit into the broader pattern of Viking life, where nothing was private, nothing was safe from the demands of gods and community. Sex, the most personal of acts, was constantly taken and reshaped into ritual. From joining with animals to drinking blood in marriage, the Vikings repeatedly showed that intimacy was never about the individual. It was always about the clan, the harvest, and the gods. And in some cases, they even believed that the very essence of strength could be captured and passed on through sexual fluids themselves. This belief that semen carried divine power reveals yet another layer of how the Vikings tied survival to the body, turning even the smallest act into a vessel of fate. Among the many unusual and sometimes shocking beliefs of the Viking world, few are as difficult for us to accept as the idea that semen carried a special power. To the Vikings, this substance was not simply a part of the body, but a direct source of life and strength. They treated it as energy, as a blessing, and as proof of vitality. The male body was seen as a vessel filled with a sacred essence, and the ability to hold on to that essence was considered a mark of discipline and strength. Men were often advised to preserve their seed, since wasting it was thought to weaken them. The logic was simple in their eyes. Every drop contained life. Every loss meant that part of a man's strength left him. A warrior who kept his body full of this essence was thought to stand taller, fight harder, and endure longer in both battle and daily life. It was not a matter of choice, but of survival. The body was a tool, and semen was one of its most important resources. The advice given to young warriors reflected this view. They were told to avoid spending themselves too often, to keep their strength within, to guard their inner power just as they guarded their weapons. It was part of training, part of becoming a man. To lose too much was seen as a sign of a weakness. To hold back was proof of courage. It is grimly ironic that while today men may be told to rest, eat well, or exercise for health, the Vikings believed the secret to strength was simply holding on to their semen. Women also played an important role in this belief. Some thought that by drinking the semen of a powerful warrior, they could absorb his energy and pass it to their unborn children. They believed this act could lead to stronger and healthier offspring. It was not seen as shameful, but as practical, even holy. Stories in old sagas describe women swallowing strength as if they were taking in the very essence of a god. For them, this was not only about desire, but about survival. If a child could inherit strength in this way, then it was worth the act. In the Viking imagination, semen was linked to the gods of fertility and power, especially Freya. They believed that divine blessing flowed through men and was carried in their bodies. To waste it was to waste the favour of the gods. To share it was to pass on strength. It turned intimacy into ritual and transformed the private act of sex into a matter of community and belief. Some tales even suggest that semen had powers beyond reproduction. It was thought to heal, to bless the soil, and to strengthen bonds. Just as blood was used in rituals of marriage and sacrifice, semen was also seen as a liquid of life. Its presence marked fertility, and its absence marked weakness. In their eyes, nothing in the body was without meaning, and this substance carried the greatest meaning of all. The pressure on men was heavy. A warrior who spent himself too freely could be mocked, treated as careless, or even unworthy of respect. His comrades might see him as lacking discipline. His strength on the battlefield would be doubted. By contrast, a man who restrained himself was admired. He was seen as hard, unyielding, full of hidden force that could explode in battle. His body became not only his own but a symbol of the strength of the clan. Women, meanwhile, were encouraged to view semen as a kind of sacred drink. By taking it in, they believed they carried the essence of courage, wisdom, and victory. This made their bodies not only vessels for children, but also vessels for the blessings of the gods. Some women even sought the seed of famous warriors, hoping to bear children who would inherit not only their blood, but also their power. Compared to modern times, where science explains health through food, medicine, and genetics, it is strange to imagine a society that thought power could be swallowed like a potion. The social effects of this belief were wide. Men were constantly measured by how well they controlled their bodies. Women were measured by how they used what was given to them. It turned intimacy into a public matter, not in the sense of display, but in the sense of expectation. Every man and woman was judged by how they handled something that most people today would consider private. It also shows how deeply survival shaped their ideas. The Vikings lived in a hard world. Every harvest, every battle, and every birth carried heavy risks. They sought strength wherever they could find it. If a belief in semen as a sacred force gave them confidence, they embraced it. If rituals surrounding it seemed to promise stronger families and armies, they practiced them. To them, it was not foolish, it was common sense. I find this belief both fascinating and unsettling. Fascinating because it shows how humans will always create meaning around the body. Unsettling because it reduced people to vessels of ritual and survival. What we treat as deeply personal, they treat as communal property. What we might hide, they raised up as holy. The sagas, carvings, and later reports remind us that this was not a hidden custom, but an open belief. The body, for the Vikings, was a battlefield and a temple at the same time. Semen was both weapon and prayer, both strength and sacrifice. When men fought, they carried not only steel but also the weight of their own stored vitality. When women sought children, they did so with the idea that each act was a transfer of divine energy. By looking at this belief, we can see the whole pattern of Viking sexuality more clearly. Sex was never only about desire or pleasure. It was always tied to community, to gods, to survival. From the raids where women were taken, to the fertility rituals that used intimacy as a blessing, to the shocking customs of testing brides and marrying the dead, every act of sex was woven into the larger story of the clan. This final belief about semen brings the picture into focus. Even the smallest part of the body could become a stage for faith, discipline, and power. The Viking world was harsh, and its people shaped harsh customs. But through these customs we see the same human struggle that exists everywhere, the desire to control fate, to hold on to strength, to pass something on to the next generation. They simply place that burden onto their bodies in ways that seem extreme to us. Looking back now, it is clear that their faith in semen was less about biology than about ideology. It gave them a sense of control in a world full of chaos. It told men they could be stronger if they restrained themselves. It told women they could bear better children if they absorbed it. It made the body a tool for the clan and a stage for the gods. And with this, the long journey through the most bizarre sexual practices of Viking times comes to an end. From the first raids to the rituals of fertility, from the control of slaves to the belief in semen as divine strength, we have seen how the Vikings mixed sex with survival, faith, and power. It was a world where nothing was private, where every act carried meaning, and where even the body itself was never truly one's own. Thank you for staying through this long and unsettling path into the private life of the Vikings. These stories remind us how different cultures can be, and how far people will go when they believe their gods demand it. May you now put these heavy images aside, rest your mind and drift into peace. Sleep well, and may your dreams be lighter than the history you just read.